Hello, and welcome back to Historian at Midnight. In the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in the city of Babylon, in the early days of the month the Macedonians called Dacios, in the year 323 before Christ, a man of 32 years old lay dying on a couch in a room crowded, hour by hour, with more and more of the officers who had followed him across the known world and out the other side of it. He had been feverish for 10 days by then, unable to speak above a whisper, and the story says that his generals, gathered in an anxious knot beside him and increasingly desperate for some word of what should happen to the vast empire he was leaving behind, finally worked up the nerve to ask him directly to whom he left his kingdom, and that he answered, with what little breath he had left, to the strongest, or perhaps, in a variant some ancient writers preferred, that he foresaw a great funeral contest fought over his body, and that he then drew a ring from his own finger and pressed it into the hand of one of the men standing closest to him, a gesture that later generations would spend the better part of 2 centuries trying and failing to fully unpack. Outside the room, by several ancient accounts, his ordinary soldiers, the men who had marched with him from the plains of Macedon to the banks of a river in India none of their own grandfathers could have named, were allowed to file past him one by one in a single silent column, and the dying king, too weak by then to speak to any of them individually, is said to have raised his hand slightly from the couch as each man passed, or turned his eyes toward them, or simply lain still and let them look at him one final time. Thousands of hardened veterans filing through a darkened room to say goodbye, in their own way, to a man not yet in his mid-30s who had led them farther than any Greek or Macedonian army had ever marched before, and who was now, in front of them, dying like any other man dies, in a bed, in pain, a very long way from home. Outside the palace walls that same week, the city of Babylon itself carried on almost exactly as it always had. Merchants haggling over the price of dates and barley in the marketplace, priests tending the daily rites at the great ziggurat temple of Marduk that had stood at the city's heart for centuries before any Macedonian had ever set foot there, farmers poling flat-bottomed boats down the slow brown current of the Euphrates, entirely unaware, or only half aware, that the foreign king whose armies had marched through their world for the past 8 years was, at that very moment, lying a short distance away, listening to his own breath grow shorter by the hour. It is a strange and genuinely humbling thing to hold in mind, at the very start of a story this large, that history's grandest turning points so rarely announce themselves to the ordinary people, living directly alongside them, that a scribe recording the day's grain prices in cuneiform on a wet clay tablet somewhere in that same city had no way of knowing that his own dry, routine entry would someday become one of the most trustworthy surviving witnesses to the exact week the ancient world changed forever. Whether every detail of that final week happened exactly as the later historians who wrote it all down, decades, and in some cases centuries afterward, say it happened, we cannot know with any real confidence, and it is worth being honest about that uncertainty at the very beginning of this long night, because almost nothing about the life we're about to spend the next several hours walking through arrives to us in a clean, unfiltered form. This is a life that was mythologized within a single generation of its own ending, retold and reshaped and occasionally invented outright by men writing for kings who needed his memory to serve their own claims to power, and we will have reason to doubt the finer details of this story more than once before the night is through. But what is not seriously in doubt is the shape of what came before that room in Babylon, and what came rushing in immediately after it. In the space of barely 12 years, a young man from a kingdom the city-states of southern Greece had long regarded as half barbarian, a rough hill country good for horses and little else, had crossed into Asia with an army that could comfortably have fit inside a single modern sports stadium, defeated in open battle the largest and wealthiest empire the world had yet produced, marched to the edge of India, and built, in the process, a personal legend so enormous that men would still be invoking his name, in earnest and in irony, in languages that did not yet exist on the day he was born, more than 2,000 years after his death, and in the space of barely a single year after that room in Babylon, the empire he had built with such staggering speed came apart in his own general's hands, the strongest never quite settled, the ring never quite explained, the whole vast structure sliding almost immediately into 40 years of war among the very men who had loved him best. That is where this long story is heading tonight, and it is worth beginning there, in the fever and the silent column of soldiers, because everything else we're about to walk through together is really an attempt to answer a single question. How does one man, dead before his 33rd birthday, manage to reshape the map of 3 continents so thoroughly that the borders he drew, the cities he founded and the language he spread would go on outliving every single one of the empires that eventually replaced his own? Alexander did not invent the world he conquered. He inherited a kingdom already reformed and already dangerous from a father whose own achievements have been quietly swallowed, in popular memory, by his son's far larger shadow, and he arrived at exactly the moment when the oldest, richest empire in the known world had grown soft enough at its centre, and divided enough among its own rival princes for a smaller, hungrier, more ruthlessly organised power to break it open. He did not build his legend out of nothing. He built it, brick by bloody brick, on a foundation his father laid, on a philosopher's careful education, on an army trained to a standard no other force on earth could yet match, and, in the end, on a restlessness that never once, across the entire span of his short life, seemed to know how to stop. This is his story, and because the two cannot honestly be separated, it is also the story of the empire he tore down, the empire he built in its place, and the empire that his own final silence left entirely and catastrophically undecided. Before we drift into the rest of this long story together, take a quiet moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely find something worth staying for in what I do here, because that is the only reason I would ever want you to. If you are new to this small corner of the internet, we are still a young channel, and having reached our first 1,000 subscribers, we are now working toward a much larger next milestone of 10,000. So if slow, unhurried, honest history of this kind is the sort of thing that helps you drift off at night, I would be genuinely grateful if you considered subscribing and helping this channel take that next step. These stories, by the way, go up early over on Spotify for creators before they appear anywhere else. So if you are watching this on YouTube, you will find that Spotify link waiting for you down in the description. And if you happen to already be listening on Spotify, simply search for Historian at Midnight on YouTube, where you will find the rest of the catalogue and everything still to come. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments below. It costs you nothing, but it helps other restless, wide-awake people find their way to this room, and there is something quietly grounding about knowing that somewhere else in the world, in a different city, under a different sky, a stranger is settling into their own bed tonight to the sound of this same old story. So let the rest of the evening go now, whatever it was holding. Sink back into whatever is under you, let your jaw unclench, let your eyes close if they are ready to, and if they are not, let them rest half open on nothing in particular, because nothing in this room needs your full attention tonight, only your company. Somewhere behind your eyes build a picture of dust and horses and a long column of men marching east into a country none of them had ever seen, and hold that picture loosely, the way you would hold the memory of a place you visited once, a long time ago, and let it carry you, slowly, into the long, strange, blood-soaked, world-altering life of the boy from Macedon who conquered more of the earth in a decade than most empires manage in a century, and who died without ever quite deciding what any of it was for, a kingdom the Greeks barely counted. To understand how Alexander became possible at all, we have to begin not with Alexander, but with the kingdom he was born into. Because for most of its history, Macedon was not a great power in Greek eyes, so much as a rough, half-civilized frontier at the northern edge of the Greek world. A mountainous, thinly populated country of shepherds, horse breeders, and quarrelling noble clans, ruled by a royal house that claimed descent from the Greek hero Heracles and from the city of Argos in the Peloponnese, a claim that the great southern city-states, Athens and Sparta and Thebes chief among them, generally regarded with polite and sometimes not so polite scepticism. The Macedonians spoke a language related to Greek but distinct enough, and pronounced strangely enough to southern ears, that Athenian orators of the 4th century before Christ could stand up in the assembly and describe the Macedonian king as coming, in their own withering phrase, not even from a place worth calling Greek at all, a country that could not so much as furnish a decent slave in the old days, in the very same breath they used to describe the barbarian peoples of Thrace and Illyria pressing on Macedon's own borders. It was a kingdom without real cities in the southern Greek sense, without an assembly of citizens debating policy in an open square, ruled instead by a king who was, at best, first among a fractious circle of noble families who could and regularly did depose him, exile him, or simply murder him and install a rival claimant in his place. A pattern of court violence so persistent across Macedonian history that a Macedonian king dying peacefully of old age in his own bed was, for centuries, closer to the exception than the rule. And yet, this same rough frontier kingdom possessed, almost by accident of geography, two resources that would eventually make it far more dangerous than its southern neighbours ever gave it credit for being. The first was horses, bred on the wide, well-watered plains of Macedonia, in numbers and in quality that the rocky, overcrowded farmland of southern Greece simply could not match, giving Macedon, from a very early period, a natural and largely uncontested advantage in cavalry that would prove decisive again and again in the wars still to come. The second was timber, silver and gold, drawn from the forests and the mountains along Macedon's own eastern frontier, resources that a sufficiently organised and sufficiently ambitious Macedonian king could, in theory, convert into the two things that mattered most in 4th century warfare: a standing professional army that never had to go home to bring in the harvest, and enough ready coin to hire the mercenaries and buy the allies that a purely citizen soldier state, fighting only part of the year with farmers pulled reluctantly from their fields, could never quite afford to match. For most of Macedon's earlier history, these advantages went almost entirely unrealised, squandered generation after generation on internal succession wars, on humiliating tribute paid to stronger neighbours, on a royal house too busy surviving its own relatives to project any serious power beyond its own borders. It would take one especially capable, especially ruthless, and especially patient king to finally weld these scattered advantages into something the rest of Greece could no longer safely ignore, and that king, as it happened, would be Alexander's own father, the father who built the machine. Philip II came to the Macedonian throne in the year 359 before Christ, at a moment when the kingdom he inherited looked, by any reasonable external measure, close to finished. Its previous king killed in battle against the Illyrians along with 4,000 Macedonian soldiers, its treasury exhausted, rival claimants to the throne backed by hostile neighbouring powers on every side, and the whole fragile structure of the state seemingly one more bad season away from simply dissolving into its component tribal pieces. Philip was, at the time, in his early 20s, and he had spent several formative years of his own youth as a diplomatic hostage in the great southern city of Thebes, held there as a guarantee of Macedonian good behaviour during an earlier round of regional conflict. And it was there, in a city that had, at that exact historical moment, briefly eclipsed both Athens and Sparta to become the single most militarily innovative power in the whole Greek world, that the young Philip watched and studied and quietly absorbed the revolutionary battlefield tactics of the great Theban general Epaminondas. Tactics built around concentrating overwhelming force at a single, decisive point of the enemy line rather than spreading strength evenly across an entire front in the old traditional Greek style. Philip returned to Macedon carrying that lesson with him, and within remarkably few years of seizing the throne, first as regent for his infant nephew, and then, once that arrangement had quietly and conveniently dissolved, as king in his own right, he set about building something that no Greek state, and very few states anywhere in the ancient world, had yet managed to build: a genuinely professional, permanently standing national army, paid a regular wage, drilled year-round rather than seasonally, and organised around a weapon Philip himself appears to have either invented outright or radically refined: an enormously long spear called the sarissa, some 18 feet in length, wielded by infantrymen packed into a dense, bristling formation called the Macedonian phalanx, a wall of overlapping spear points that no conventional hoplite line, armed with the far shorter spears traditional Greek warfare relied on, could hope to break through by direct assault. Alongside this new infantry, Philip built up the one arm in which Macedon had always held a natural advantage into something genuinely without peer anywhere in the Greek-speaking world: an elite heavy cavalry force known as the Companions, drawn from Macedon's own noble families, and trained to fight not as a loosely organised aristocratic skirmishing force in the old style, but as a single disciplined striking arm, capable of delivering a coordinated battle-deciding charge at exactly the moment the enemy line had already been fixed and weakened by the phalanx's own grinding advance. A combination of hammer and anvil that Philip's own son would soon take and refine into one of the most consistently devastating tactical systems the ancient world would ever see. A boy raised on wolves and philosophy, Alexander was born in the Macedonian capital of Pella in the summer of 356 before Christ, on a night that later Greek writers, always eager to dress a great life in suitably great omens, insisted was the very same night that the great temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the wonders of the ancient world, burned to the ground, prompting one wit of the period to remark, so the story goes, that the goddess had been too busy attending Alexander's own birth to notice her temple catching fire back home. His mother Olympias was a princess of Epirus, a mountainous kingdom to the west of Macedon, and a woman whose own reputation among ancient writers was every bit as formidable and every bit as unsettling as her sons would eventually become, deeply devoted to the ecstatic, snake-handling rites of Dionysian religion, widely practiced in her own homeland, a devotion several ancient sources describe with a mixture of fascination and open discomfort, including persistent stories that live snakes were kept in her private chambers, and that Philip himself, catching sight of one coiled beside his sleeping wife on more than one occasion, grew increasingly convinced that some power greater than an ordinary mortal husband had a claim on her, a suspicion that Olympias herself, by several accounts, did nothing whatsoever to discourage, later encouraging the persistent rumour that Alexander had been fathered not by Philip at all but by Zeus himself, appearing to her in the form of a serpent, a story Alexander seems to have found genuinely useful rather than genuinely troubling as his own career advanced. Philip and Olympias' own marriage grew steadily colder as the years passed, strained by Philip's frequent campaigning, by his other wives and mistresses in a Macedonian royal court, where polygamy among kings was an accepted political tool for cementing alliances, and by Olympias' own fierce, watchful ambition for her son, an ambition that left the young Alexander growing up in a household defined as much by tension and rival factions as by any ordinary domestic warmth. It was in this same charged household that one of the most famous anecdotes of Alexander's entire boyhood unfolded, when a horse trader named Philonicus brought a magnificent but seemingly unmanageable stallion to Philip's court, a horse so wild and so dangerous that no rider among Philip's own experienced grooms and cavalrymen could get near enough to mount it, and Philip, disgusted, ordered the animal taken away as worthless, until the young Alexander, watching from the sidelines and reportedly no older than 12 or 13 at the time, spoke up and declared that the men trying to ride the horse were simply losing a magnificent animal through their own lack of skill, having noticed, where the grown men had not, that the horse was shying away from its own moving shadow rather than from any genuine viciousness, and asked his father for permission to try himself, turning the horse gently to face directly into the sun so that its own shadow fell harmlessly behind it rather than dancing in front of its eyes. Alexander calmed the animal, mounted it, and rode it successfully in front of the entire assembled court, and Philip, watching his young son bring under control an animal every grown man in his service had failed to manage, is said to have wept with pride and told him that Macedon was too small a kingdom to contain him, and that he had better go looking for one that would fit him properly, a line that later biographers, writing with the full benefit of hindsight, could hardly resist repeating as an almost eerily accurate prophecy. The horse, Bucephalus, meaning ox head, for the shape of the brand or the shape of his own skull, depending on which ancient explanation one prefers, would go on to carry Alexander through every major battle of his life for the next 20 years, from the plains of Macedonia to the banks of a river in India, a single, constant animal companion across an entire adult lifetime spent almost never standing still. When Alexander turned 13, Philip determined that his heir should receive an education equal to his own evident intelligence, and equal to the scale of ambition Philip himself already harboured for Macedon's future, invited the philosopher Aristotle, then one of the most respected thinkers to have passed through Plato's own academy in Athens, to come north and personally tutor his son, offering by way of enticement to rebuild Aristotle's own hometown of Stagira, which Philip had earlier destroyed in one of his campaigns, and to resettle its scattered former citizens, an offer Aristotle accepted. For roughly 3 years, Alexander and a small circle of Macedonian noble boys his own age, several of whom would go on to become his most trusted generals and companions across the entire Eastern campaign still to come, studied under Aristotle at a secluded retreat called Mieza, a kind of rural academy built around a shaded garden and covered walkways where philosophy in this period was traditionally taught through walking conversation rather than formal lecture, and where Aristotle, whose own restless intellectual curiosity ranged across ethics, politics, medicine, botany and zoology in roughly equal measure, appears to have left a lasting and genuinely varied mark on his most famous pupil, an interest in natural science and geography that Alexander would carry with him across his entire campaign, later sending back to his old tutor from deep inside Asia samples of previously unknown plants and animals for study, and an appetite for Homer's Iliad so complete that Alexander is said to have kept his own personal copy, annotated by Aristotle himself, and reportedly kept in a specially made jewelled casket looted from the Persian royal treasury, tucked beneath his pillow at night for the rest of his life, alongside a dagger, treating the story of Achilles less as ancient literature to be studied at a comfortable distance than as a genuine living model for how a short and glorious life ought actually to be lived. Among the boys who studied alongside him at Mieza were Hephaestion, who would grow into Alexander's closest companion, and by the clear implication of several ancient sources, quite possibly his lover as well, Ptolemy, who would go on to found his own royal dynasty in Egypt after Alexander's death, and Cassander, the son of Philip's own senior general Antipater, who would, in a detail this story will have grim reason to return to before the night is over, eventually order the deaths of both Alexander's mother and his young son. It was a genuinely close, genuinely formative circle of friendship, forged years before any of them had any real notion of the empire they would one day help conquer, or the empire they would, just as thoroughly, one day help tear apart. Philip spent the better part of the next 2 decades using this new military machine, backed by relentless diplomacy, well-timed bribery of rival politicians in enemy cities, and a personal willingness to fight in the front rank of his own battles that cost him an eye at one siege, and very nearly his life at several others, to methodically absorb the Greek-speaking tribes and cities pressing on Macedon's own borders, secure the gold and silver mines of Mount Pangaean that would go on funding his campaigns for years afterward, and gradually, patiently, city by city and alliance by alliance, extend Macedonian influence deep into a southern Greek world that had, only a generation earlier, dismissed his entire kingdom as barely worth the trouble of conquering. Athens and Thebes, watching this expansion with mounting alarm, eventually set aside their own long and bitter rivalry to form a coalition against him, and the two sides met in the year 338 before Christ at a place called Chaeronea, in a battle that would decide, in a single afternoon, the entire future direction of Greek political life. It was there, commanding the companion cavalry on his father's own left flank, that an 18-year-old Alexander led the decisive charge that broke the elite Theban sacred band, an all-volunteer force of paired lovers and comrades who had never before been defeated in battle, and who, by the account that has come down to us, died almost to the last man rather than break formation and run. A devastating debut for the young prince, and a devastating final defeat for the independent political power of the old Greek city-states, who would never again, as a collective force, seriously challenge Macedonian dominance of the Greek mainland, the night Philip died. In the aftermath of Chaeronea, Philip organised the defeated Greek states, along with nearly every other Greek city outside Sparta's own stubborn holdout, into a formal alliance known to modern historians as the League of Corinth, an arrangement that left the individual cities nominally free and self-governing while binding them, in practice, to follow Macedonian leadership in matters of foreign policy, and crucially, to contribute troops and ships to a grand invasion of the Persian Empire that Philip had already begun planning as the next and greatest achievement of his own reign, a war of revenge framed publicly as payback for the Persian invasions of Greece a century and a half earlier, but driven at least as much by Philip's own need for fresh conquests and fresh plunder to keep his newly built military machine fed, paid and occupied. It was at exactly this moment, with the invasion force already being assembled and the advance units already sent across into Asia Minor to secure a beachhead, that Philip's own household exploded into precisely the kind of lethal internal crisis that had ended so many Macedonian reigns before his. Philip had taken a new wife, a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra, in a marriage that pointedly sidelined Alexander's own mother, the fiercely proud Epirot princess Olympias, and that raised, at the wedding feast itself, an open and drunken insult from the bride's own uncle about the legitimacy of any future heir Alexander himself might someday try to claim, an insult sharp enough that Alexander, by the account that has survived, hurled a cup at the man's head, and that Philip, staggering drunk himself, drew his own sword and lunged at his son before tripping and falling flat on the floor in front of the entire assembled court, prompting Alexander to remark, with a coldness that says a great deal about where father and son already stood with one another, that here was a man preparing to cross from Europe into Asia who could not even make it safely from one couch to another. Alexander and his mother left the court in the bitter aftermath of that scene, and though a formal reconciliation of sorts was eventually patched together, the underlying tension in the royal household never fully healed. It was into this same charged and unresolved atmosphere that, in the summer of 336 before Christ, Philip was assassinated at the wedding celebration of his own daughter, stabbed to death by one of his own royal bodyguards, a young nobleman named Pausanias, who was cut down himself moments later by other guards as he tried to escape on a horse he had, by several accounts, arranged to have waiting nearby in advance. The stated motive, and the one most ancient sources treat as at least the immediate trigger, was a deeply personal grievance. A sexual assault Pausanias had suffered at the hands of associates of the very same uncle of the bride Cleopatra, whose insult had so recently poisoned the royal wedding feast, compounded by Philip's own refusal to grant Pausanias any real justice for it. But rumours implicating far more powerful figures began circulating almost immediately, and have never fully stopped circulating since, with suspicion falling at various points across the following 2,000 years of historical debate on the Persian king Darius III, eager to remove a dangerous enemy before his invasion could even properly begin, on Olympias herself, whose fury at her own and her son's recent humiliation was hardly a secret at court, and most uncomfortably of all for later admirers of Alexander, on Alexander himself, standing to gain everything, immediately and completely, from his father's sudden death at the precise moment their own relationship had grown so visibly strained. No ancient source offers anything close to conclusive proof for any of these theories, and that deserves saying plainly rather than pretending to a certainty the evidence simply does not support. But what is beyond dispute is what happened in the days immediately following the murder. The 20-year-old Alexander, moving with a speed and a ruthlessness that would characterize nearly every crisis of his entire life, secured the loyalty of the army before any rival claimant could organize an alternative, and ordered the swift execution of every plausible competing heir he could locate, including a young cousin and, not long afterward, Cleopatra's own infant child by Philip, along with, by the darker accounts, Cleopatra herself, a purge that left the 20-year-old Alexander, the undisputed king of Macedon, sitting atop the single most formidable army the Greek world had ever produced, with his father's already launched invasion of Persia sitting, unfinished and waiting, directly in front of him, securing a shaking throne. In the weeks immediately following his father's murder, before any Greek city had time to fully test the young king's own resolve, Alexander moved south to the isthmus city of Corinth, where representatives of the League of Corinth that Philip had organised 2 years earlier were persuaded, or in a number of cases simply pressured, into confirming the 20-year-old Alexander in his father's own place as hegemon, supreme military commander of the allied Greek states, and, crucially, inheritor of Philip's already planned invasion of Persia. It was during this same visit to Corinth that Alexander is said to have sought out the philosopher Diogenes, a famously eccentric ascetic of the Cynic school, who lived, by deliberate choice and as a standing rebuke to conventional ambition, in extreme poverty, reportedly sleeping in an old ceramic storage jar and owning almost nothing beyond a cloak, a staff, and a bowl, and whose blunt, unimpressed contempt for wealth, status, and social convention had already made him something of a minor celebrity among the philosophically curious of the Greek world. Alexander, curious to meet a man whose reputation for indifference to power was apparently genuine, found Diogenes sunning himself on the ground outside the city and offered, as king and as the new master of Greek military affairs, to grant him absolutely anything he wished. And Diogenes, without troubling to sit up, is said to have replied only that Alexander might step aside since he was currently blocking the sunlight. Alexander's companions reportedly laughed at what they took to be an old crank's rude joke at the new king's expense. But Alexander himself, by the account that has come down to us, walked away visibly impressed rather than offended, remarking to those around him that if he were not Alexander, he would wish to be Diogenes. A small, quiet anecdote that nonetheless captures something genuinely important about the young king's own self-image. A man who wanted, even at the very outset of his reign, to be seen as someone capable of recognising and respecting a kind of greatness entirely different from, and entirely unmoved by his own. The news of Philip's assassination reached the rest of the Greek world within days, and it reached it accompanied, in more than a few cities, by an immediate and entirely predictable calculation that a 20-year-old king, untested outside his own father's shadow, presented an obvious opportunity to shake off Macedonian domination altogether. Thebes rose in open revolt first, encouraged by rumours, false as it turned out, that Alexander had actually been killed campaigning in the north, and several other Greek cities, Athens prominent among them, began quietly preparing for the same possibility while waiting to see how the crisis would actually unfold. Alexander's response was immediate and by any measure breathtaking in its speed. Marching his army south with a pace that left the rebelling cities almost no time to properly coordinate or reinforce one another, he appeared outside the walls of Thebes itself within roughly a fortnight of the revolt's beginning, having covered, in that short span, a distance that would ordinarily have taken an ancient army considerably longer to traverse. And when the city, still disbelieving that this could really be the same young Alexander they had assumed dead, refused his offer of clemency, he stormed it, breached its walls, and then did something that shocked the entire Greek world far more deeply than the siege itself. He allowed the city to be utterly destroyed, its buildings levelled to the ground with the single, pointed exception of the temples and the house that had once belonged to the poet Pindar, and its surviving population, somewhere in the range of 30,000 people by the ancient accounts, sold outright into slavery. Amid the chaos of the sack, one particular story survived that later writers seized upon as a rare moment of individual dignity inside the general horror. The story of a Theban noblewoman named Timoclea, whose house was broken into by a Thracian mercenary officer serving in Alexander's own army, a man who assaulted her and then demanded to know where she had hidden her family's gold and silver, and Timoclea, leading him to a well in her own garden and telling him the treasure lay at the bottom, watched him climb down to look for it and then, without hesitation, began hurling large stones down on top of him until he was dead, after which she was seized by his own soldiers and dragged before Alexander himself to answer for the killing. Asked who she was, she is said to have answered with the same composed defiance she had shown the officer himself, identifying herself as the sister of a Theban general who had died fighting Philip years earlier at Chaeronea, and Alexander, whether moved by her courage, her lineage, or simply the theatre of the moment, ordered her released along with her children, unharmed, one small, deliberately preserved story of mercy that ancient writers clearly wanted, remembered precisely because of how starkly it stood out against the tens of thousands of Thebans who received no such consideration at all that same week. It is one of the first genuinely dark moments of this entire long story, and it is worth sitting with it honestly rather than hurrying past it, because it establishes this early and this brutally a pattern that will recur again and again across the years still to come. Alexander was capable, when he judged it politically useful, of an almost theatrical, carefully calculated mercy, sparing a single poet's house amid total destruction as a pointed, self-conscious gesture toward the value of Greek culture, even in the act of annihilating a Greek city, and he was equally capable, in the very same breath, of a scale of violence against ordinary non-combatant civilians that even his own contemporaries found genuinely shocking, and that modern historians have never found any comfortable way to soften. The destruction of Thebes worked, in the narrowest and most immediate political sense, exactly as Alexander appears to have intended it to work. The rest of the Greek world, watching one of its own oldest and most celebrated cities erased from the map within a matter of days, abandoned any further thought of open revolt for years afterward, and Athens itself, which had been quietly preparing to join the uprising, sent frantic embassies of apology and submission the moment word of Thebes' fate arrived. Alexander accepted the Athenian submission, largely because Athens' fleet and cultural prestige remained genuinely useful to him, and turned his full attention, at last, toward the invasion his father had planned and he himself had now inherited, gathering an army of somewhere around 32,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, a force that, set against the vast manpower reserves of the Persian Empire he was about to attack, looks, on paper, almost recklessly small, and that would need every single advantage in training, tactics, and leadership that Philip's reforms and Alexander's own emerging genius could possibly provide it, because the empire waiting for him on the other side of the Hellespont was, by any conventional measure, one of the largest and wealthiest states the human world had yet produced. The empire waiting on the other side. Before following Alexander across the Hellespont, picture for a moment the scale of what this young king was actually proposing to attack, because the Persian Empire of Darius III was no crumbling relic, ripe for easy plucking, but rather the largest and most administratively sophisticated state the ancient world had yet produced, founded some 200 years earlier by Cyrus the Great, and expanded by his immediate successors, until it stretched, at its fullest extent, from the Aegean coast of Asia Minor in the west to the Indus River in the east, and from the steppes of Central Asia in the north, down through Egypt and the Arabian Desert in the south, a territory so vast that a courier riding the famous Persian Royal Road, a network of maintained highways with regularly spaced relay stations stocked with fresh horses, could still take the better part of 3 months to cross it from end to end, even using the fastest transportation the ancient world possessed. The empire was governed through a system of provincial governors called satraps, each responsible for collecting tribute, maintaining order, and raising local levies within his own province, a structure flexible enough to absorb dozens of different peoples, languages, and religious traditions, Egyptians and Babylonians, Lydians and Phoenicians, Bactrians and Indians, under a single loose imperial umbrella that demanded tribute and occasional military service, but generally left local customs, local gods, and local elites largely undisturbed, so long as tribute kept flowing toward the royal treasuries at Susa and Persepolis, treasuries that had, by Alexander's own day, accumulated wealth on a scale that no single Greek city-state, and arguably no combination of them, could ever have hoped to match. That same empire, moreover, carried with it a long and genuinely painful history with the Greek world Alexander claimed to be avenging, a history that gave his invasion, whatever its deeper personal and dynastic motives, a real and immediately recognizable propaganda value among his own Greek and Macedonian troops. A century and a half before Alexander's own birth, the Persian king Darius I had launched an invasion of mainland Greece that ended in a stinging defeat at the plain of Marathon, and his son Xerxes had returned a decade later with a force so large that ancient writers strained for centuries afterward to find numbers vast enough to describe it. A campaign remembered for the doomed, defiant stand of 300 Spartans and their allies at the narrow pass of Thermopylae, for the naval victory the Greeks won soon after at Salamis, and, less gloriously for the Greek side of the story, for the burning of Athens itself, its temples on the Acropolis put to the torch by Persian soldiers before the Greek alliance finally drove Xerxes' army back out of Greece for good. That burning remained in Greek memory one of the great unavenged humiliations of the entire classical period, invoked by orators and playwrights for generations afterward, and Philip and then Alexander after him understood exactly how useful that old grievance still was, dressing up what was, at bottom, a war of conquest and personal glory in the far more palatable language of a long-delayed reckoning, payment finally collected for a debt the Greek world had never stopped quietly resenting. Darius III himself, the King Alexander was actually about to fight, had come to his own throne only a few years before the invasion began, elevated after a violent sequence of court assassinations and poisonings, had cleared away several more direct claimants to the Achaemenid line. A king whose own grip on power was in truth considerably less secure than the empire's sheer size and wealth might suggest to an outside observer. A weakness at the very top of an otherwise formidable state that Alexander, arriving with an army a fraction of the size Darius could theoretically muster, would prove remarkably skilled at exploiting again and again. To put the scale of it in terms a modern listener can actually hold in mind, the Persian Empire at its height covered something in the range of 2 million square miles, a territory that would today comfortably contain the modern nations of Turkey, Egypt, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, combined with a considerable amount of Central Asia left over, ruled in its entirety by a single royal court and a single royal treasury, and defended, on paper at least, by a pool of manpower that Persian mobilization at full strength could, according to the more careful modern estimates that discount the wilder ancient claims of Xerxes-era invasion numbers, still have brought into the field in the high hundreds of thousands, a force that Alexander's own invading army, numbering perhaps 37,000 men in total when it first crossed into Asia, would need to defeat not once but repeatedly against steadily accumulating odds if it hoped to survive even its own first campaigning season. A spear thrown into the sand. In the spring of 334 before Christ, Alexander led his army across the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, and the story that has come down to us, whether embellished in the retelling or not, insists on a gesture almost too perfect in its symbolism to have been anything other than deliberate, that as his ship approached the Asian shore, Alexander himself, still fully armed, threw his spear from the deck so that it stuck upright in the sand of the beach ahead, and then leapt down after it, claiming in that single physical act the entire continent he was about to invade as territory won, quite literally, by the spear. Before pressing on to confront the Persian forces gathering to meet him, Alexander made a detour that tells us a great deal about how he understood his own place in history, travelling to the site of ancient Troy, where he laid a wreath at what was believed to be the tomb of Achilles, ran a ceremonial race naked around the tomb in the old heroic style, and exchanged, by one account, his own armour for a shield said to have survived from the Trojan War itself, a shield he would carry with him as a kind of talisman for the rest of his campaigning life. It is worth pausing on the sheer, almost unguarded sincerity of this gesture, because Alexander was not merely performing piety for a watching audience here. He genuinely appears to have modelled his own understanding of glory and of a short, blazing life traded for undying fame directly on the figure of Achilles from Homer's own epic, a poem he is said to have kept, annotated in his own hand by Aristotle, tucked beneath his pillow along with a dagger for the rest of his life, and the parallel he was drawing for himself, and for everyone watching him draw it, could not have been plainer. Like Achilles before him, he had crossed the sea to fight a war on Asian soil, and like Achilles he seems to have expected, and in some genuine sense to have wanted, a life that burned shorter and brighter than any ordinary span of years could ever manage. Travelling with the army from this same early point in the campaign was a seer named Aristander of Telmessus, a professional diviner whose interpretations of omens, sacrificial entrails and unusual natural events would go on shaping Alexander's own decisions at nearly every major turning point still to come in this story, from the reading of the lunar eclipse before Gaugamela to the warnings of the Chaldean priests outside Babylon in the campaign's final year. Ancient armies of this period rarely moved or fought without some formal ritual of divination beforehand, a sacrifice offered, and its entrails read for favourable or unfavourable signs, and Aristander's own particular skill, by every surviving account, lay less in any mystical insight than in a shrewd, practised talent for finding a genuinely favourable reading in almost any set of circumstances Alexander happened to present him with, an interpretive flexibility that served Alexander's own morale and Alexander's own sense of divine sanction for whatever he had already decided to do extremely well across 12 consecutive years of campaigning. Whether Aristander himself was a true believer in his own craft or simply a gifted and useful political instrument who understood exactly what his king needed to hear before every difficult decision, the ancient sources never quite settle, and it is, in its own small way, one more example of the same central uncertainty running underneath this entire story. The impossibility, at this distance, of separating genuine ancient belief from calculated ancient theatre, when the two so often wore exactly the same face. The first real test of Alexander's new army against Persian force came almost immediately, at a river called the Granicus, where a Persian force of local satraps and Greek mercenaries had gathered to meet the invasion before it could push any further inland. The battle very nearly killed Alexander before his campaign had properly begun at all, the young king leading his cavalry in a direct, characteristically reckless charge across the river and into the teeth of the Persian line, where he was struck hard enough by an enemy officer's blade to have his helmet split and his own life saved. By the traditional and often repeated account, only by the intervention of one of his own companions, who cut down the attacker at the last possible instant. The Macedonian army broke the Persian line decisively, and Alexander, in the aftermath of the victory, made a calculated political gesture that would become one of the defining features of his entire subsequent campaign. He ordered the several thousand captured Greek mercenaries who had fought on the Persian side, men he judged to have betrayed the common Greek cause by taking Persian pay against a supposedly pan-Hellenic war of revenge, sold into slavery or, by some accounts, executed outright as traitors, while treating the ordinary Persian dead and the surviving Persian nobility with a more conventional, almost businesslike respect, a distinction that reveals something important about how carefully Alexander was managing his own public story from the very earliest days of the invasion, presenting himself, wherever it served him, not as a foreign conqueror, but as the legitimate liberator and avenger of the entire Greek world, conquering a sea from dry land. In the months immediately following Granicus, Alexander faced a genuine strategic puzzle that a less unconventional commander might have solved very differently, because the Persian navy, drawing on the experienced Phoenician and Cypriot fleets that formed its core, remained entirely intact and entirely capable of threatening his own supply lines back to Greece, or even of landing a Persian army behind him to strike at an undefended Macedon, and Alexander's own comparatively small Greek fleet stood no realistic chance of defeating it in open battle at sea. Rather than risk that fleet in a confrontation he was likely to lose, Alexander made the strategically unconventional decision to simply disband the greater part of his own navy and instead deny the Persian fleet, port by port, every harbour along the eastern Mediterranean coast it might otherwise have used, reasoning correctly as it turned out that a fleet with nowhere left to dock, resupply, or recruit its own rowers was effectively a fleet already defeated, whatever its remaining numerical strength on paper. This strategy carried him first to the city of Miletus, captured after a hard-fought siege, and then to Halicarnassus, a far more heavily fortified city defended by the exiled Persian satrap Memnon of Rhodes, the single most capable commander serving on the Persian side throughout the early years of the war, whose skilled and stubborn defence of the city's walls and towers cost Alexander's own besieging forces genuine losses before Memnon, recognising the city could not be held indefinitely, evacuated his remaining garrison by sea under cover of night, and left Alexander to occupy the ruins of a city he had won but that his own siege had left substantially burned and broken. Memnon's death from illness not long afterward, before he could fully organise the kind of sustained Persian naval counter-offensive he alone among Darius's commanders appears to have had both the skill and the strategic imagination to attempt, removed the single greatest threat to Alexander's own rear for the remainder of the war, one of several moments across this story where a stroke of pure, unearned good fortune did nearly as much for Alexander's ultimate success as any battle he actually won. What it was actually like to march with him. Picture, for a moment, what Alexander's army actually looked and sounded and smelled like on an ordinary day of the march, rather than on the handful of days when it happened to be fighting one of the handful of battles that later histories, this one included, spend nearly all of their attention describing, because for every single day Alexander's soldiers spent actually fighting across those 12 years, there were dozens spent simply moving, an enormous column of men, animals and equipment stretched out for miles along whatever road or open ground the terrain allowed, sarissa points catching the sun in long, bristling rows, visible from a considerable distance before the men carrying them could be made out individually, dust rising in a haze thick enough on the dry plains of Asia Minor and Mesopotamia to be seen by watching scouts long before the army itself came into view. Behind the fighting men trailed a baggage train that, by the time the army reached the Persian heartland and had absorbed years of accumulated plunder, included mule handlers, siege engineers hauling disassembled towers and catapults, and, increasingly as the years passed, an enormous and largely uncounted population of camp followers, merchants selling supplies and small luxuries to soldiers flush with plunder, slaves captured along the way, and, in growing numbers as the campaign stretched past its early years, the wives, both Macedonian and increasingly Persian and Asian, and the children that ordinary soldiers had acquired along the route, so that by the campaign's final years, the column moving through Central Asia and India may well have included nearly as many non-combatants as soldiers, an entire mobile society uprooted from a dozen different homelands and dragged, mile after mile, behind a young king who rarely stayed anywhere long enough for any of them to properly put down roots. The physical toll of simply keeping pace with Alexander, quite apart from any actual fighting, was genuinely immense, and it is a part of this story that the ancient sources, fixated as they understandably are on battles and sieges and palace intrigue, tend to pass over with only occasional scattered mention. Alexander employed specially trained surveyors known as bematists, professional pacers whose entire job was to walk alongside the army, counting their own steps with disciplined precision in order to measure and record the distances the expedition covered, a project that produced, for the first time in Greek history, something approaching an accurate working map of the vast stretch of Asia the army had crossed, and modern historians, working from the fragments of that Baptist record that survive in later geographical writers, have calculated that Alexander's army covered something in the range of 11,000 miles over the roughly 8 years of active campaigning between the crossing of the Hellespont and the turn back from the Hephaestus, walking, on many stretches, through terrain that ranged within a single year from the scorching heat of the Mesopotamian plain to the freezing high passes of the Hindu Kush mountains, crossed at altitudes where soldiers, according to surviving accounts, went snowblind, suffered frostbite severe enough to require amputation, and in a number of documented cases simply froze to death overnight in their own bedrolls. A quieter, less dramatic, but no less real form of the same relentless attrition that would eventually claim so many more lives in the Gedrosian desert. The knot at Gordium. As Alexander's army advanced further into Asia Minor over the following months, moving from city to city, and, in most cases, finding local populations remarkably willing to switch their allegiance from a distant Persian king to a young conqueror who often reduced their tribute and confirmed their existing local governance rather than upending it entirely. He arrived in the winter of 333 before Christ at the old Phrygian city of Gordium, where an ancient wagon stood in the temple of Zeus, its yoke bound to its pole by an intricate, densely tangled knot of cornel bark, a knot that local legend held could only be untied by the man destined to rule the whole of Asia. Generations of hopeful adventurers, by the time Alexander arrived, had already failed to work the knot loose by conventional means, and Alexander himself, after examining it closely and finding no visible end to unravel, is said to have either drawn his sword and simply cut straight through the entire knot in a single decisive stroke, or, in a somewhat less dramatic version the ancient sources also preserve, pulled the pin securing the yoke to the pole and slid the whole assembly free without cutting anything at all. Which version actually happened, if either did, in quite the form later writers describe, we cannot now say with any confidence, but the version that survived and spread, the sword and the single decisive stroke, tells us something genuinely important about how Alexander himself, and the world watching him, had already begun to understand his particular genius, not as the patience to slowly work through a difficult problem strand by careful strand, in the manner of an ordinary methodical ruler, but as the nerve to force an impossible situation open through a single, irreversible act of will, a habit of mind that would win him an empire at speed no patient, methodical conqueror could ever have matched, and that would, in the final accounting this story will eventually have to make, leave behind it a great many knots, including the largest and most consequential one of all, that he never once thought to sit down and actually untie, the chessboard tips at Issus. By the autumn of 333 before Christ, the Persian king Darius III, who had spent the opening phase of the war delegating command of his western forces to regional satraps, while he himself gathered a truly massive royal army in the Persian heartland, judged the moment had finally come to confront the invader personally, and the two armies met near the town of Issus, on a narrow coastal plain hemmed in on one side by mountains and on the other by the sea, terrain that crucially prevented Darius's vastly larger numbers from ever fully deploying or enveloping the smaller Macedonian force, a tactical gift that Alexander characteristically recognised and exploited within moments of the battle beginning. Leading, as he nearly always did, from the very front of his own cavalry, Alexander drove a decisive charge directly toward the Persian king's own position in the centre of the line, close enough by the ancient accounts that Darius himself could see the Macedonian king cutting through the ranks of his own royal guard, and close enough that Darius, whether from genuine tactical necessity or from something closer to raw panic, turned his own chariot and fled the field, an act that shattered the morale of the entire Persian army far more thoroughly than the actual military situation at that specific moment strictly required. Elsewhere along the line that same afternoon, the fighting was considerably less lopsided than Alexander's own decisive cavalry charge might suggest, the Macedonian phalanx struggling to keep its own dense formation intact while crossing the shallow but uneven river Pinarus under fire, and running into unexpectedly stiff resistance in the centre of the field from several thousand Greek mercenaries fighting in Persian pay, men equipped and drilled in much the same hoplite tradition as the Macedonians themselves, who inflicted real and costly casualties on Alexander's own infantry before the collapse of Darius's own cavalry, and the general Persian route finally rendered their own continued resistance pointless. Darius escaped, abandoning his chariot, his cloak, his bow, and, in one of the most consequential decisions of the entire war, his own mother, wife, and children, all of whom fell into Alexander's hands as the Persian camp was overrun. Among the spoils left behind was Darius's own royal tent, and the story that has come down to us, whether polished in the retelling or not, says that when Alexander first entered it and saw the gold basins, the perfumed bathing chamber, and the sheer, almost incomprehensible luxury of a Persian king's travelling quarters laid out before him, he turned to his own officers and remarked, half in wonder and half in something closer to unease, that this, apparently, was what it actually meant to be a king. A line later writers found irresistible, precisely because of how much distance it captured between the rough, practical, campaign-hardened world Alexander had grown up in and the almost unimaginable opulence of the empire he was in the process of dismantling one battle at a time. What Alexander did with the captured Persian royal family reveals, once again, the careful, deliberate theatre of magnanimity he wove through even his most ruthless campaigns, because rather than treating Darius's mother Sisygambis, his wife Statera, and his children as ordinary spoils of war, humiliated or ransomed for maximum political leverage in the conventional style, Alexander visited them personally, assured them of their continued royal treatment and safety, and reportedly went to considerable lengths to preserve their dignity, including by one famous and much repeated anecdote, a moment when Sisygambis, upon first being brought before the two young men accompanying Alexander, mistakenly prostrated herself before the taller and more richly dressed of the pair, his close friend Hephaestion, before being gently corrected, and Alexander is said to have told her not to worry, that Hephaestion too was Alexander, a phrase whose exact meaning and implication historians have debated for 2,000 years, but that at minimum signals just how completely Alexander wished to be seen and remembered as gracious in victory. Sisygambis, by several ancient accounts, grew genuinely and lastingly attached to Alexander over the following years, to the point that news of his eventual death is said to have driven the elderly Queen Mother to stop eating entirely, dying within days of her own son's greatest enemy, a detail that, whether precisely accurate in every particular or not, captures something real about the strange, complicated, genuinely human relationships Alexander built, even with the family of the empire he had set out to destroy, the queens who outlasted a war. Darius's own wife Stateira, captured alongside her mother-in-law and her children at Issus, remained in Alexander's custody for the better part of 2 years as the war ground on, and the ancient sources are notably, almost pointedly consistent in insisting that Alexander treated her throughout with complete propriety, a claim later writers seem to have found worth stressing precisely because ancient royal custom would have considered it entirely unremarkable, expected even, for a conquering king to simply take a captured enemy queen as a concubine, and Alexander's evident restraint on this specific point became, in the retelling, one more carefully polished facet of his own reputation for magnanimity and victory. Stateira died in captivity in the winter of 332 before Christ, apparently in childbirth or from complications following one, and Darius himself, receiving the news through a captured eunuch who had escaped back to the Persian camp, is said to have wept and, on questioning the man closely about how his wife had actually been treated during her captivity, to have come away so genuinely convinced of Alexander's honourable conduct that he reportedly prayed aloud, in front of his own assembled court, that if he himself could not keep the Persian throne, he hoped it would pass to no one but Alexander. A story ancient writers plainly relished for how neatly it flattered their subject, whatever its precise reliability. Sisygambes, the formidable queen mother who had once mistaken Hephaestion for the king himself, remained at Alexander's court for the rest of the war, present at the Susa weddings years later to see her own granddaughters married into the Macedonian nobility, and living long enough, as this story has already told you, to starve herself to death in grief within days of learning that Alexander himself had finally died in Babylon, a queen who had lost a son's throne, a daughter-in-law, and in her own private accounting by that final point, very possibly a second son in every sense but blood, all within the span of a single decade, 7 months against a city in the sea. Rather than pursuing the fleeing Darius immediately into the heart of the Persian Empire, Alexander made the more cautious and, in retrospect, strategically sound decision to first secure the entire eastern Mediterranean coastline, denying the still formidable Persian navy any friendly ports from which to threaten his own supply lines back to Greece. And it was this decision that brought him, in the year 332 before Christ, to the island city of Tyre, a Phoenician stronghold built on a small island roughly half a mile off the mainland coast, protected by walls that rose, by ancient report, some 150 feet in places directly out of the sea itself, and defended by a population confident enough in their city's natural defences to reject Alexander's initial offer of peaceful submission outright. What followed was one of the most extraordinary siege operations of the entire ancient world, Alexander ordering his engineers to construct an enormous stone and timber causeway, nearly 200 feet wide, extending directly out from the mainland shore toward the island itself, using the rubble of an older, abandoned mainland settlement as raw material, a project that took his army 7 gruelling months to complete under constant harassment from Tyrian ships, catapults, and, by one particularly vivid ancient account, an improvised weapon involving heated sand poured down onto the attacking soldiers, causing burns severe enough that some men are said to have torn off their own armour in agony in full view of the enemy. Engines against the sea. The technical achievement underlying the siege deserves to be named on its own terms, because Alexander's own engineering corps, led by a specialist named Diades, who had trained under the great engineer Polyidus, and who would go on to write what became a standard ancient manual on siege warfare, brought to Tyre a level of mechanical sophistication that few armies anywhere in the ancient world could have matched. Floating siege towers mounted on lashed-together ships to bring catapults and boarding parties directly against the island's own seawalls, battering rams swung from timber frames to pound at stonework that had stood, until that year, entirely unthreatened by any attacker in the city's long history, and torsion catapults capable of hurling stone shot and heavy bolts, with enough force to punch through masonry that no earlier Greek siege technology could have touched. The Tyrians, for their part, proved themselves engineers of real ingenuity as well, countering the approaching siege towers with grappling hooks designed to snap free the tower's own protective hide coverings, divers sent to sabotage the causeway's underwater foundations, and in the single most vivid piece of improvised defence the siege produced, great metal braziers of sand heated over fires until it approached the temperature of the sand itself, glowing, then catapulted or poured directly down onto the attacking soldiers below, sand fine enough to work its way beneath armour and burn skin, in a way straightforward fire arrows never could. A detail ancient writers recorded with the same mixture of horror and grudging admiration this channel has learned to expect whenever ordinary people, backed into a genuine corner, discover exactly how resourceful desperation can make them. When the causeway and the siege towers built along it finally allowed Alexander's forces to breach the city's walls, the fighting inside Tyre turned into something close to a massacre. Macedonian soldiers who had spent 7 exhausting, dangerous months building their way toward this moment, giving no quarter as they poured through the breach, and the aftermath once the fighting itself had finally ended was every bit as brutal as the siege that preceded it. Some 6,000 to 8,000 Tyrians are recorded as having died in the fighting itself, and Alexander, in a display of calculated public cruelty clearly intended to deter any future city from daring to resist him the way Tyre had, ordered roughly 2,000 surviving military-age men crucified along the shoreline, their bodies left displayed for a considerable distance along the coast, while the remaining population, women and children included somewhere in the range of 30,000 people, was sold into slavery. It is worth naming plainly that the destruction of Tyre sits alongside the destruction of Thebes as one of the clearest and most disturbing pieces of evidence that Alexander's famous magnanimity toward defeated royalty, real as it was in cases like that of Darius's own family, existed in the very same man, often within months of one another, as a capacity for mass violence against ordinary civilians that no amount of later hero worship has ever fully managed to soften or explain away, and it is a pattern worth carrying forward with us, quietly, as this story continues, because it will not be the last time we see it. What the man at the centre of it all actually looked like. It is easy. Across a story this dominated by battles and cities and the movements of entire armies, to lose sight of what Alexander himself actually looked like to the people standing in front of him, and the ancient descriptions that survive, filtered as always through writers working decades after his death, agree on a handful of details worth holding in mind. He was, contrary to the towering, larger-than-life figure later art and popular imagination would eventually build around his name, almost certainly on the shorter side by ancient standards, fair-skinned and reportedly prone to a ruddy flush across his chest and face, with thick, tawny hair that ancient writers frequently compared to a lion's mane, and a habit noted by multiple sources and clearly visible in the portrait busts sculpted during and shortly after his own lifetime, of tilting his head slightly to one side and gazing slightly upward, a mannerism so closely associated with him that several of his own successors, once they had become kings in their own right, deliberately adopted the very same tilted upward gaze in their own royal portraiture, borrowing a piece of his physical presence the way a smaller company today might borrow the visual branding of a much larger, more famous one. He broke, without apparent hesitation, from the near-universal Greek and Macedonian custom of adult men wearing full beards, going clean-shaven himself for reasons the ancient sources never fully explain, whether personal preference, practical concern about an enemy grabbing a beard in close combat, or simple vanity about his own youthful appearance, and the fashion he set, whatever its actual origin, spread across the entire Hellenistic world in the wake of his conquests so thoroughly and so quickly that the clean-shaven look would remain the dominant standard for elite Greek and Roman men for the following several centuries, one more small, easily overlooked piece of an empire that outlived its own founder by 2,000 years and counting. The sculptor Lysippos, who by ancient report was the only artist Alexander ever formally permitted to carve his official portraits in stone, and the painter Apelles, granted a similar exclusive royal license to paint him, together shaped an idealized public image, restless-eyed, faintly melancholic, permanently youthful, that would go on to define how nearly every later century, right down to our own, has pictured a face that not one single person alive today has ever actually seen, filtered as it is through Roman copies of Greek originals, themselves already once removed from whatever the real, breathing, 32-year-old man in that room in Babylon actually looked like. By the final year of his life, Alexander's own body carried a fairly complete physical record of the 12 years he had spent almost never out of danger. A helmet split clean through by a sword at the Granicus that came within a hair's breadth of ending his life before the campaign had properly begun. A thigh pierced by a dagger during the siege of a Persian hill fortress. A shoulder struck by an arrow during a punishing campaign against mountain tribes north of India. A leg broken by a stone during another siege in Sogdiana, and most seriously of all, an arrow that would later punch through his breastplate and lodge near his lung during the assault on a fortified Indian town still to come in this story, an injury several ancient sources agree he never fully recovered from. Taken together, the accumulated damage paints a picture considerably more physically vulnerable than the invincible, untouchable Conqueror of popular legend, a man who led from the front of every major engagement of his entire career by deliberate personal choice rather than necessity, and who paid for that choice again and again in a currency of scar tissue that no gilded portrait bust or flattering court sculptor ever thought it wise to include: a liberator in Egypt. From the smoking ruins of Tyre, Alexander pushed south into Egypt, a province that had chafed for generations under Persian rule, and that by every ancient account welcomed the Macedonian army not as a conquering force but as a genuine liberation, the Persian garrison surrendering with barely a fight, and the Egyptian priesthood, whose own religious and political authority the Persians had repeatedly clashed with and occasionally violated outright, formally crowning Alexander as pharaoh, a title he seems to have accepted with considerable enthusiasm, recognizing with the same instinctive political flexibility he had already shown in his treatment of the captured Persian royal family, that ruling Egypt effectively meant working within, rather than against, its own deeply ancient religious and administrative traditions, rather than imposing a foreign Macedonian system wholesale on top of them. It was in Egypt, near the mouth of the Nile, that Alexander founded what would become, by a very wide margin, the single most consequential and longest-lasting city bearing his own name, laying out, personally, and according to several ancient accounts, using nothing more than a trail of scattered grain to mark the initial street plan, when he ran short of chalk, the foundations of Alexandria, a city that would go on, within a generation of his own death, to become the intellectual and commercial capital of the entire Eastern Mediterranean world, home to the greatest library the ancient world would ever assemble, and a city that, unlike so much else, this restless conqueror would build and unbuild across his short life, is still there today, still carrying his name nearly 2,500 years later. The founding itself, by the account several later writers preserved with evident relish, came wrapped in its own small cluster of omens. With no chalk on hand to mark out the intended street plan on the ground, Alexander's surveyors used barley meal instead, tracing the outline of walls, avenues and temples across the chosen site, until a great flock of birds descended without warning and ate every last scattered grain, an event Alexander's own seers, when consulted, chose to interpret not as an ill omen, but as a promise that the city would one day grow rich and generous enough to feed multitudes drawn from every nation under the sun, a reading of events that, whatever it actually says about 4th century Macedonian augury, turned out, across the following several centuries of Alexandria's own genuine prosperity, to be one of the more accurate predictions in this entire story. It was also during this Egyptian sojourn that Alexander undertook one of the strangest and most genuinely mysterious detours of his entire campaign, a difficult journey across open desert to the remote oasis of Siwa, deep in the Libyan sands, to consult the oracle of the god Ammon, an Egyptian deity the Greeks had long since identified with their own Zeus, and whose remote sanctuary had, by Alexander's own time, acquired a reputation for oracular authority that rivaled even the great oracle of Apollo at Delphi in mainland Greece. What exactly Alexander asked the oracle, and what answer he received, was never fully disclosed by Alexander himself, and the ancient sources, writing decades and centuries later, could only speculate and elaborate based on rumour and later political convenience. But the story that most persistently attached itself to the visit, whether accurately reported or substantially embroidered afterward, held that the oracle's priest greeted Alexander as the son of Zeus himself, a title Alexander appears never to have explicitly claimed for himself in any surviving official document, but that he also, notably, never once bothered to correct or deny when others began repeating it, a careful, deliberate ambiguity that would grow over the following years of his campaign into one of the more genuinely destabilizing undercurrents running beneath his relationship with his own increasingly uneasy Macedonian officer corps, men who had grown up regarding their king as a talented admiral but entirely mortal fellow nobleman, and who found the prospect of serving a living god considerably harder to stomach. The last army of Persia. With Egypt secured and his own western flank now entirely safe from Persian naval interference, Alexander turned east once more, in the summer of 331 before Christ, to finally confront Darius and the full, overwhelming might of the Persian Empire's central army, gathered this time on ground of the Persian king's own careful choosing, a wide, deliberately levelled plain near the village of Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq, chosen and prepared specifically to allow Darius's vastly superior numbers, including, by the more dramatic ancient estimates, scythed chariots and a contingent of war elephants brought all the way from India, room to fully deploy and this time to envelop the smaller Macedonian force from every side at once. The numbers involved, however imperfectly recorded by ancient writers prone to wild exaggeration on the Persian side and quiet modesty on their own, give some sense of just how audacious the whole engagement actually was. Alexander fielding something in the range of 47,000 men, infantry and cavalry combined, against a Persian force ancient sources inflate to numbers exceeding 1,000,000, but that modern historians, working from more careful analysis of the terrain, the logistics of feeding and watering such a host, and the actual space available on the battlefield itself, generally scale down to a still formidable range of perhaps 250,000 men at the outside, meaning Alexander's own force, even by the most conservative modern reckoning, faced odds of somewhere between 4 and 5 to 1 and won decisively anyway, a testament less to any single tactical trick than to the accumulated compounding advantage of years of superior training, superior discipline, and a command structure capable of executing a complex coordinated manoeuvre under the genuine chaos and terror of actual battle in a way no hastily assembled multinational Persian levy, however numerous, could realistically match. Roughly 2 weeks before the two armies finally met, the moon itself darkened and turned a deep, ominous red over the Macedonian camp in a total lunar eclipse, a genuine astronomical event that modern calculation can date with confidence to the 20th of September in that same year, and while such an eclipse might easily have been read in the superstitious military culture of the ancient world as a terrifying omen of the impending disaster, Alexander's own courtiers, whether through genuine conviction or simple practiced political usefulness, instead interpreted the darkened moon as a favourable sign specifically for the Greeks and a portent of doom for the Persians, a reading that steadied rather than unsettled the army's nerves in the tense final days before the largest battle any of them had yet fought. The night before the battle, with his own senior general Parmenion reportedly urging a surprise night attack to offset the enemy's overwhelming numerical advantage, Alexander is said to have refused, declaring that he would not steal his victory like a thief, and to have then gone to sleep so soundly and so late into the following morning that his own officers grew alarmed and had to wake him personally, a story that later writers clearly relished for what it suggested about the young king's own supreme, almost supernatural confidence on the very eve of the largest and most dangerous battle of his entire life. The battle itself, when it finally came, unfolded as one of the true masterpieces of ancient tactical warfare, Alexander deliberately advancing his own line at an oblique angle away from the centre of the Persian formation, drawing Darius's own cavalry further and further out to the flanks in an effort to encircle him, until a gap opened in the weakened Persian centre. A gap Alexander, watching for exactly this moment, drove his companion cavalry straight through, in a wedge-shaped charge aimed directly at Darius's own position, forcing the Persian king, for the second time in 2 years, to abandon his own army and flee the field rather than risk capture. The Persian army, its centre broken and its own king already in flight, collapsed into a rout, and although Alexander was forced to break off his own pursuit of Darius to ride back and rescue his hard-pressed left flank under Parmenion, which had come dangerously close to being overwhelmed by the Persian cavalry, no longer needed to chase Alexander's own advancing wedge, the battle ended in an overwhelming, empire-shattering Macedonian victory. Gaugamela effectively ended any realistic Persian hope of reversing the invasion through open battle, and in its immediate aftermath, the great cities of the Persian heartland itself, Babylon, Susa, and eventually Persepolis, opened their gates to Alexander one after another, their own local governors and populations judging further resistance pointless against an army that had now defeated the full might of the Persian state not once but twice. The regent, the mother, and the war back home. While Alexander pushed ever deeper into Asia, the kingdom and the wider Greek world he had left behind did not simply sit quietly waiting for his return, and it is worth remembering, if only briefly, that an entire second front of Alexander's reign was being managed, the whole time, by people who never once crossed the Hellespont themselves. Alexander had left Macedon and oversight of the wider Greek world in the hands of Antipater, one of Philip's own most trusted and most capable generals, a man now well into his 60s who would go on to govern the Macedonian homeland, largely without incident but never without difficulty. For the entire 11 years of Alexander's own absence, managing tax collection, garrison duty, and the perpetually simmering resentments of Greek cities that had never fully reconciled themselves to Macedonian domination. That resentment boiled over into open war in 331 before Christ, the very same year as the Battle of Gaugamela, when the Spartan king Agis III, judging Alexander's deep entanglement in Persia a rare opportunity to finally shake off Macedonian influence in the Peloponnese, raised a substantial mercenary army and led a genuine, if ultimately unsuccessful, rebellion against Antipater's authority, a conflict that culminated in a hard-fought battle near the city of Megalopolis, in which Agis himself was killed and his rebellion crushed, a war fought and won entirely without Alexander's own direct involvement, thousands of miles away and, by most accounts, receiving news of the whole affair only well after it had already been decided, a reminder that the Macedonian war machine Philip had built was by this point genuinely capable of running 2 simultaneous wars on 2 separate continents at once. Antipater's own relationship with Alexander's mother Olympias, meanwhile, was one of open and increasingly bitter mutual hostility. The fierce, politically ambitious Queen Mother chafing under a regent she considered, not entirely without justification, to be quietly accumulating independent power of his own in Macedon, while her son was away winning glory in Asia, and the two exchanged, across the following decade, a long and increasingly hostile correspondence with Alexander himself, each accusing the other of overstepping their proper authority, complaints Alexander is said to have received with a certain weary, practised detachment, remarking to at least one companion that his mother's letters and the price she was asking him to pay in political capital for her satisfaction cost him a very great deal for a single month's lodging in her womb, a dry, characteristically Alexander line that nonetheless captures something real about how exhausting it evidently was to manage a fierce, capable, and entirely uncowed mother from several thousand miles away, while simultaneously conquering an empire. The tension between Olympias and Antipater never fully resolved itself in Alexander's own lifetime, and it would resurface with far deadlier consequences for nearly everyone involved in the chaotic wars of succession that followed his death, when Olympias, no longer restrained by any living son to answer to, would move against Antipater's own family with a ruthlessness that finally matched, and in some ways exceeded, anything her son had ever shown on any battlefield. And Alexander, entering Babylon in triumph, and later formally proclaimed king of Asia by his own assembled army, found himself, at not yet 25 years old, the master of an empire whose full extent even he had not yet had time to properly survey. Babylon itself, when Alexander's army marched through its gates, was almost certainly the largest and most architecturally overwhelming city any of his Macedonian and Greek soldiers had ever laid eyes on, its outer walls, by ancient report, thick enough for a four-horse chariot to turn a full circle along their own broad top, its famous Ishtar Gate faced in glazed blue brick and decorated with rows of sculpted lions and dragons, and its ziggurat temple complex dedicated to the god Marduk, rising in stepped terraces high enough to be visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain, a building later Greek visitors would come to associate, whether accurately or not, with the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. The city's legendary hanging gardens, counted by later Greek writers among the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and traditionally said to have been built by an earlier Babylonian king for a homesick wife who missed the green mountains of her own distant homeland, may or may not have still existed in anything like their original form by the time Alexander's own army arrived, and modern archaeologists have never definitively located their remains at all. Some scholars now arguing the gardens described by later Greek sources were actually built not in Babylon, but far to the north in the Assyrian capital of Nineveh, and were simply misattributed by later, more distant writers. One more small example, layered on top of so many others across this story, of how thoroughly legend and geography can drift apart from the sober archaeological record over the span of a few centuries. Palaces of gold change hands. The wealth that fell into Alexander's hands as the great Persian treasuries surrendered one after another almost defies easy description even now, the treasury at Susa alone yielding, by ancient report, a sum in gold and silver bullion so enormous that modern historians who have attempted to convert the figures into any meaningful comparative measure of ancient purchasing power have generally concluded that Alexander, within the space of a few short months, had come into possession of more precious metal than had probably ever before been assembled in a single place in the whole of recorded human history. Wealth that he immediately began using to pay off the enormous debts he had accumulated, financing the invasion, to reward his own officers and soldiers with donatives on a scale that instantly made many of them wealthier than they had ever imagined possible, and to fund the ever more ambitious campaigns he was already, restlessly, beginning to plan further to the east. But it was at Persepolis, the ceremonial and spiritual heart of the entire Persian Empire, the city where Persian kings had for 2 centuries received tribute and homage from every corner of their vast dominions, that Alexander's occupation of Persia produced its single most controversial and most genuinely puzzling episode, an event that ancient writers themselves could not agree on how to interpret and that modern historians still argue about today. After occupying the city for several months and allowing his own soldiers, by several accounts, to loot it with a thoroughness and a brutality that shocked even hardened observers used to the ordinary violence of ancient warfare, Alexander, during a lavish banquet held deep into a night of heavy drinking, and reportedly egged on by an Athenian courtesan named Thais, who is said to have suggested, in front of the assembled and increasingly drunk company, that it would make a fitting final gesture of revenge for the Persian burning of Athens a century and a half earlier, personally led a procession that set fire to the magnificent royal palace complex, a building that had taken generations of Persian kings to construct and decorate, and that burned, by every account, to the ground. Whether the burning of Persepolis was, as the drunken banquet story suggests, a genuinely impulsive act carried out in a haze of wine and half-remembered patriotic grievance, or whether it was, as some ancient and modern historians have argued instead, a coldly calculated political decision dressed up afterward as spontaneous revelry, intended to send an unmistakable message that the old Achaemenid Persian monarchy was now finished for good, and that Alexander himself, having symbolically destroyed its most sacred ceremonial seat, had no intention of simply stepping into Darius's old shoes as a continuation of the same dynasty, we cannot now say with any real certainty, and it is one of the more genuinely puzzling contradictions of Alexander's entire career, that he would go on, within remarkably short order, to adopt so much of the very same Persian royal court, culture, dress, and ceremony that the burning of Persepolis had seemed at the time to so violently reject. What is not in doubt is the human cost sitting quietly underneath the symbolism, because Persepolis was, before it was a symbol of anything, a living city, home to ordinary Persian families, craftsmen, priests, and administrators, who had no more personal responsibility for the burning of Athens a century and a half earlier than any ordinary Macedonian soldier in Alexander's own army did, and whose own homes, workshops, and modest fortunes went up in the very same fire that consumed the royal palace, a detail that the more triumphant ancient accounts of the burning tend to pass over in near total silence. The king who would not stop running. Darius III, having fled the field at Gaugamela for the second and final time, retreated eastward into the more remote provinces of his own crumbling empire, gathering what remained of his loyal forces and hoping, evidently, to make one final stand somewhere beyond Alexander's immediate reach, or perhaps simply to survive long enough to negotiate some kind of settlement from a position other than total, humiliating defeat. Alexander pursued him relentlessly, driving his own troops through exhausting forced marches across some of the harshest terrain of the entire campaign, and as it became increasingly clear to Darius's own remaining commanders that their king's cause was now entirely lost, a group of them, led by a satrap named Bessus, turned on Darius themselves, arresting him, and eventually, as Alexander's pursuing cavalry closed the final gap, stabbing the Persian king and leaving him to die, abandoned in a wagon by the side of the road, rather than allow him to fall alive into Macedonian hands. Alexander arrived at the scene, by the most commonly repeated account, only shortly after Darius had already died, and the story that has come down to us, whether entirely accurate or shaped by later writers eager to present Alexander in the most flattering possible light, insist that the young conqueror was genuinely moved by the sight of the man he had spent 2 years pursuing and defeating, lying dead and betrayed by his own subordinates, that he removed his own cloak and laid it over Darius's body, and that he subsequently sent the body back to the Persian royal family for a full and honourable royal burial in the traditional manner of Achaemenid kings. It is worth naming this moment honestly for what it actually represents, because it sits, once again, in that same uneasy space between calculated political theatre and something that at least resembles genuine human feeling, that has already appeared so many times across this story, Alexander gaining enormous propaganda value from being seen, by Persian and Macedonian observers alike, as the man who honoured a fallen enemy king rather than gloating over his corpse, while also, quite possibly, feeling something real and complicated in that moment. A recognition, perhaps, that the man he had hunted for 2 years across half a continent had, in the end, died exactly the way so many ancient kings died, betrayed and abandoned by the very men who owed him their loyalty. Alexander pursued Bessus and the other conspirators relentlessly over the following months and years, eventually capturing Bessus himself deep in the mountains of Bactria, where he was subjected to a punishment of calculated, ritualized brutality, his nose and ears cut off in the old Persian style of punishment for regicide, before being sent to Ecbatana for formal trial and execution, a punishment Alexander clearly intended once again as a public demonstration that he himself was now the legitimate avenger and successor of the murdered Persian king, rather than merely his conqueror, a role he had, by this point in the campaign, begun to inhabit with an ease and an enthusiasm that troubled a growing number of his own oldest Macedonian companions. Among the Persians who entered Alexander's own inner circle during these same years was a young eunuch named Bagoas, who had previously served at the Persian royal court and who joined Alexander's own retinue after Darius's death, becoming, by the account of several ancient writers, a genuine favourite, and, by the fairly clear implication of Quintus Curtius Rufus in particular, quite possibly a lover as well, a relationship several ancient sources treat as unremarkable within the conventions of both Persian and, to a lesser extent, Macedonian court culture, where relationships between a king and a favoured young man carried nothing like the social stigma later centuries would attach to them. The single most vivid surviving anecdote concerning Bagoas describes a public entertainment held during the army's return march through Persia, where Bagoas, competing in a dancing contest, won the crowd's favour so completely that Alexander's own assembled soldiers, according to Plutarch, began shouting for the king to kiss the victor in front of the entire gathered army, and Alexander, to the audible delight of the crowd, did exactly that. A small, human, entirely public moment of affection that later, more prudish centuries of retelling would either quietly omit or treat with considerably more discomfort than Alexander's own contemporaries, by every surviving indication, actually felt at the time, becoming what he conquered. As Alexander pushed the boundaries of his new empire further east into the remote and difficult provinces of Bactria and Sogdiana, in what is now Afghanistan, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, a growing and increasingly bitter rift began opening between the young king and a significant portion of his own oldest Macedonian officer corps, men who had marched with him and, in many cases, with his father before him, and who watched with mounting alarm as Alexander began adopting more and more elements of the traditional Persian royal court he had, only a few years earlier, set out so violently to destroy, wearing a modified version of Persian royal dress that combined Macedonian and Achaemenid elements, taking Persian wives and Persian courtiers into his own inner circle, and, most controversially of all, beginning to expect from his own visitors a Persian court ritual known as proskinesis, a gesture of formal obeisance that ranged depending on the relative rank of the person performing it, anywhere from a simple bow to a full prostration, a gesture that carried, for Persian subjects accustomed to their own traditional royal hierarchy, no particular religious weight at all, but that struck freeborn Macedonians and Greeks, raised in a political culture that drew a very sharp and very meaningful distinction between the honour owed to a mortal king and the worship owed to an actual god, as something close to sacrilege, an uncomfortable echo of exactly the kind of god-king pretension the oracle at Siwa had left hanging, unresolved, over Alexander's own reputation. Alexander's own reasoning for adopting so much Persian court culture appears, by the most sympathetic and probably the most accurate modern reading, to have been genuinely strategic rather than simply personal vanity, or a case of a young conqueror being seduced by the trappings of absolute monarchy, a calculated attempt to present himself credibly to his vast new Persian and Central Asian subject population, not as a foreign occupier, but as the legitimate successor to their own traditional kings, a fusion policy that extended well beyond mere court ceremony into the active recruitment and training of Persian and other local troops into his own army, and that would eventually culminate years later in mass intermarriage between his Macedonian officers and Persian noblewomen, a genuinely ambitious, genuinely far-sighted vision of a single blended imperial elite governing a vast multi-ethnic empire together, rather than a narrow Macedonian ruling class permanently lording it over a resentful and permanently subjugated, conquered population. but whatever the strategic logic behind it, the immediate effect on Alexander's own oldest Macedonian companions was corrosive and in more than one case fatal, because a growing number of them experienced this fusion policy not as far-sighted statesmanship, but as a personal betrayal, a sense that the young king they had followed across half the known world was quietly transforming himself into exactly the kind of oriental despot their entire Greek and Macedonian political culture had been raised to view with instinctive contempt, and this simmering resentment, left unresolved, would soon explode into open and ultimately fatal confrontation. The fusion policy also marked, whether Alexander himself ever framed it this way or not, a quiet but genuine break from the political philosophy of the very teacher who had raised him, because Aristotle himself, in his own surviving political writings, argued for a fairly rigid distinction between Greeks, whom he considered naturally suited to freedom and self-governance, and non-Greek peoples, whom he described, in language that reads uncomfortably to modern ears, as naturally suited to a kind of subordinate role in relation to their Greek superiors, advice that later biographers claim Aristotle explicitly passed on to his own royal pupil before the invasion of Persia even began, urging Alexander to rule the Greeks he conquered as a leader guiding free men, and to rule the Persians and other Asian peoples he conquered as a master rules slaves or livestock, treating them as fundamentally, permanently other, rather than as future partners in a shared empire. Alexander's own actual conduct, whatever the sincerity or the calculation behind it, diverged sharply and repeatedly from that advice, incorporating Persian nobles into his own inner circle, training Persian soldiers to fight alongside rather than beneath Macedonians, and staging at Susa the very mass intermarriage between conqueror and conquered that Aristotle's own stated worldview would have found almost unthinkable, a genuinely striking instance of a pupil outgrowing, or at minimum sharply diverging from, the explicit teaching of one of the greatest philosophical minds of the entire ancient world, and doing so not in some abstract classroom argument, but in the actual practical governance of the largest empire anyone then living had ever seen assembled. Whether Alexander ever discussed this particular disagreement with his old tutor directly, the surviving record does not say, though the relationship between the two men, close and affectionate in Alexander's boyhood, appears to have cooled considerably in later years, not helped by the fact that Aristotle's own nephew, Callisthenes, would eventually die on Alexander's own orders, a family wound that a philosopher as famously measured and self-controlled as Aristotle is unlikely to have simply forgotten. Wine, theatre, and the weight of every night. To understand how a single drunken evening could eventually end in the death of a man who had once saved Alexander's own life, it helps to understand what an ordinary Macedonian royal banquet, a symposium in the Greek-style Macedon had long since adopted and then pushed to its own harder drinking extreme, actually involved by this stage of the campaign. Wine at these gatherings was typically drunk, not sipped politely, but consumed in sustained competitive rounds. Toast following toast late into the night, a culture of hard drinking that Macedonian court tradition had always prized as a mark of manly endurance even before Alexander's own reign, and that seems, by the consistent testimony of multiple ancient sources, to have grown measurably heavier as the campaign wore on, and the accumulated stress of constant command, constant danger, and, in the final years, constant grief settled more and more visibly onto Alexander himself. These same banquets doubled more often than not as informal courts and informal theatres, poets and musicians performing between rounds of drinking, officers reciting favourite passages of tragedy from memory, since Alexander's own well-documented love of the Athenian playwright Euripides, whose verses he is said to have known well enough to quote at length, meant that scenes from plays like the Bacchae or the Andromache were as likely to fill a given evening as any purely military conversation, a strange and genuinely human detail, battle-hardened generals sitting late into the night, quoting tragic poetry back and forth to one another in a tent thousands of miles from the Athenian stage those same lines had first been written to be performed on. It was into exactly this charged, exhausted, wine-soaked poetry-quoting atmosphere that Clytus's fatal insult and Alexander's fatal spear throw would eventually arrive. A reminder that the single most consequential moment of personal violence in this entire story did not erupt from nowhere, but grew directly out of a nightly ritual of drink and performance and half-serious competitive boasting that Alexander's own court had been repeating, with steadily rising stakes for years, the killing of an old general. The first, and in some ways the most chilling sign of exactly where that unresolved tension was heading, arrived in the autumn of 330 before Christ, in the province of Draniana, when a conspiracy, or the rumour of one, was uncovered among a group of junior officers plotting against Alexander's own life. The details reaching Alexander implicated, whether fairly or not, Philotas, the commander of the elite companion cavalry and the son of Parmenion, the single most senior and most trusted general remaining from Philip's own generation, a man who had commanded Alexander's own left flank at Gaugamela, and whose steady, experienced hand had, by more than one account, saved the battle when Alexander's own reckless pursuit of Darius nearly cost him his own exposed rear. Philotas, informed of the plot by a junior officer days before it reached Alexander's own ears, had failed to report it promptly, whether out of simple carelessness, genuine ignorance of its seriousness, or, as his accusers charged, active complicity. And Alexander, whose relationship with the proud, popular, occasionally indiscreet Philotas had already been quietly souring for some time, seized on the delay as evidence of guilt, had Philotas arrested, tortured according to Macedonian legal custom for treason, and brought before an assembly of the army for trial, where a confession extracted under torture, whatever its actual reliability, was accepted as sufficient grounds for a death sentence, and Philotas was executed by his own former soldiers. Philotas's death alone might have ended there, a grim but not unprecedented episode of wartime justice, except for the calculation that followed immediately behind it, because Parmenion himself, though entirely uninvolved in any conspiracy and in fact stationed at that moment far away in Media, guarding Alexander's treasury and lines of communication, was, in Alexander's own clear-eyed political reasoning, now simply too dangerous to be allowed to live. An old general commanding thousands of loyal troops of his own, who could not reasonably be expected to greet the judicial killing of his own son with anything but fury, and who might, if left alive and left in command, become the rallying point for exactly the kind of mutiny Alexander could least afford deep in hostile territory. Alexander therefore sent secret orders ahead by fast courier to Parmenion's own subordinate officers in Media, men Parmenion himself had trained and trusted completely, instructing them to kill him before news of his son's execution could possibly reach him. And Parmenion, a general who had served Philip loyally for decades and Alexander loyally for 6 years since, who had helped build the very army that had conquered the whole of the Persian Empire, was murdered without trial, without warning, and without any real chance to answer an accusation that was never formally brought against him at all, cut down by men who had served under him for years, on the direct written order of the king he had never once, by any surviving account, betrayed. The killing of Parmenion sent a message across the entire army that needed no ancient historian to spell it out, and that Alexander's own oldest Macedonian officers understood immediately and completely. Loyalty, however long and however proven, was no longer any guarantee of safety once the king's own suspicion had settled on a man, and rank, however senior, offered no protection at all against a suspicion that could travel faster by courier than any accused man could travel to defend himself. It marks, by the judgment of a great many historians looking back across the full sweep of Alexander's career, the clearest single hinge point at which the calculating, occasionally ruthless but generally purposeful young king who had crossed the Hellespont 6 years earlier began visibly curdling into something colder and more genuinely dangerous to be near, a transformation that the murder of Clytus and the execution of Callisthenes, both still to come, would only continue and deepen. A spear thrown in anger. That confrontation arrived at a drunken banquet in the city of Maracanda in Sogdiana in the autumn of 328 before Christ, where Alexander and a circle of his senior officers had been drinking heavily, in the increasingly hard-drinking style that had become, by this stage of the campaign, one of the more troubling features of Alexander's own court, and where a veteran officer named Clytus, a man who had served under Philip before Alexander was even born, and who had by most accounts personally saved Alexander's own life at the Granicus years earlier, began openly and increasingly bitterly mocking the flattering courtiers who had been comparing Alexander's own achievements favourably to those of his father Philip, insisting, with the blunt disrespect that heavy drinking and old, genuine intimacy can sometimes produce between men who have known each other for decades, that Alexander owed his entire success to the army and the kingdom Philip had built for him, and going on, as the argument escalated and both men grew angrier, to openly mock Alexander's adoption of Persian customs and his increasingly godlike self-presentation, reminding him pointedly of exactly whose Macedonian blood and whose Macedonian soldiers had actually done the fighting and dying that had made him great. What happened next unfolded by every ancient account with terrifying speed. Alexander, by this point in the evening thoroughly drunk himself and enraged beyond any capacity for restraint, lunged at Clytus, was physically restrained by other officers, broke free, seized a spear from one of the guards standing nearby, and drove it directly through Clytus's body, killing the man who had once saved his own life on the battlefield in a single, irreversible act of drunken fury. The immediate aftermath, by every surviving account, was a collapse into genuine and extended anguish, Alexander reportedly attempting, or at least appearing to attempt, to turn the same spear on himself before being physically restrained by his own attendants, refusing food and water for several days afterward, and remaining so visibly and so genuinely devastated by grief and guilt that his own officers and philosophers were eventually obliged to intervene, with one of the court philosophers, a cynic named Anaxarchus, reportedly arguing to him, in a piece of moral reasoning that has troubled readers for 2,000 years, that a king, being effectively the source of law and justice himself, could not by definition commit an unjust act. A piece of flattering, self-serving philosophy Alexander appears to have found genuinely comforting, even as it marked, for many later observers looking back on this whole episode, one of the clearest and most disturbing signs of exactly how far unchecked absolute power had already begun corroding the young king's own judgment and self-restraint. The bow that would not bend. The tension between Alexander's own growing autocracy and the older, more egalitarian Macedonian political traditions his officers had grown up expecting, reached its final, fatal breaking point roughly 2 years later, in a crisis that began, on the surface, as a dispute over court ceremony, but that ended in the death of one of the most celebrated intellectual figures of the entire expedition, Callisthenes, a nephew of Aristotle himself and the official court historian tasked with recording Alexander's campaign for posterity, had already made himself unpopular with the increasingly sensitive king by refusing publicly, and on principled philosophical grounds, to perform the full proskinesis prostration that Alexander had begun requiring of visitors to his court, arguing that such total submission was appropriate only before a god, and not before a mortal Macedonian king, however extraordinary his achievements, an argument that a significant portion of Alexander's own Macedonian and Greek officer corps privately agreed with, even as most of them, under mounting social and political pressure, gradually complied with the ritual anyway rather than risk the king's open displeasure. Callisthenes' principled resistance made him a natural rallying point for a group of younger Macedonian noblemen serving as royal pages, aristocratic youths training for future command who were traditionally granted close, intimate access to the king's own person, and when a conspiracy formed among several of these pages to assassinate Alexander in his sleep, a plot that was discovered and crushed before it could be carried out. Alexander seized on Callisthenes' known association with the conspirators, however tenuous the actual evidence connecting him to the plot itself may genuinely have been, to have the historian arrested and, by most accounts, either tortured to death or left to die in chains while the army continued its march, a death that shocked and alienated a wide swathe of Greek intellectual opinion back home, and that stands as one of the clearest single moments in Alexander's entire career where personal paranoia and wounded royal vanity visibly overrode both justice and, in the most literal sense, his own historical legacy, since Callisthenes had been, until that exact moment, the very man responsible for shaping how the wider Greek world would come to understand and remember him. Ghosts in the mountains. While all of this court drama was unfolding, Alexander was simultaneously fighting one of the longest, hardest, and least glamorous campaigns of his entire career, a grinding multi-year guerrilla war against the fiercely independent local warlords and mountain tribes of Bactria and Sogdiana, a region whose difficult terrain, scattered fortified strongholds, and population of skilled horse archers proved far more resistant to Alexander's conventional battlefield tactics than any of the great set-piece engagements against the full Persian royal army had ever managed to be. It was a war fought less through decisive pitched battles than through a relentless, exhausting sequence of sieges against remote mountain fortresses, punitive raids against villages suspected of harbouring resistance fighters, and periodic massacres intended in the same calculated style as the destruction of Thebes and Tyre before it, to terrorise the wider local population into submission, and it produced, along the way, one of the more famous individual episodes of Alexander's entire eastern campaign, the siege of a seemingly impregnable mountain stronghold known to later writers as the Sogdian Rock, held by a local nobleman named Oxyates, who had sent his own family there for safekeeping, confident that its sheer, near-vertical cliffs made it entirely unassailable, until Alexander, offering a substantial reward to any soldier willing to attempt the ascent, saw a party of several hundred of his own men scale the supposedly impossible cliff face under cover of darkness using climbing pegs and ropes, appearing above the fortress at dawn in a position that convinced its defenders, who had genuinely believed no human force could reach them, that Alexander's army must possess soldiers capable of actual flight, and who surrendered the position without further resistance. Not every episode of this grinding mountain war ended in a mere siege, and one incident from these same years, reported by several ancient sources though disputed by others and treated with real caution by modern historians, deserves to be named honestly precisely because of how uncomfortably it sits alongside Alexander's more flattering reputation for cultural respect. Deep in Sogdiana, Alexander's forces are said to have come upon a settlement of people called the Branchidae, descendants, according to the story, of a family of Greek priests who generations earlier, at the temple of Apollo at Didyma near Miletus, had betrayed the god's own sacred treasures to the invading Persian king Xerxes, and had subsequently been resettled, for their own safety from Greek retribution, deep in the heart of the Persian Empire, where their descendants had lived quietly, and by several accounts had remained proudly and demonstrably Greek in language and custom, for a century and a half by the time Alexander's army found them. According to the account preserved by Quintus Curtius Rufus, Alexander, on learning of their ancestors' old betrayal, ordered the entire settlement massacred, men, women, and children alike, and their town razed, a punishment inflicted not for anything the people standing in front of him had themselves done, but for a decision made by their great-great-grandparents 150 years earlier, a story that, if true in anything like the form Curtius reports it, sits among the darkest and most genuinely disturbing single acts of Alexander's entire career, and that a number of modern historians have questioned on the grounds that no other surviving source mentions it, and that its details read almost too neatly, like a moralizing exercise in the horrors of collective punishment for a Roman-era audience. A genuine and unresolved scholarly dispute, This channel will simply name honestly here rather than pretend to settle either way. Among the captives taken at the Sogdian Rock was Oxyarte's own daughter, a young noblewoman named Roxana, whom several ancient sources describe as the most beautiful woman in all of Asia after the wife of Darius himself, and whom Alexander, in a decision that surprised and by several accounts troubled some of his own Macedonian officers, chose to marry apparently, and unusually for a dynastic royal marriage of this period, out of at least some genuine personal attraction and affection, rather than purely for the political advantage such a match with a prominent local Sogdian family would obviously bring in, helping to finally pacify the region. Whatever the precise mixture of romance and calculation behind it, the marriage did help stabilise Alexander's control over Bactria and Sogdiana, and it produced, though not until after Alexander's own death, an heir whose brief and ultimately tragic life would become entangled, alongside his mother's own, in the very succession crisis that Alexander's dying refusal to name a clear heir would soon set violently in motion. Not long after the fall of the Sogdian Rock, Alexander faced a second, even more formidable mountain stronghold in the same general region, a fortress belonging to a local nobleman named Chorines, perched even higher and even more inaccessibly than Oxyarte's own rock had been, surrounded by a deep ravine that made any direct assault look close to suicidal, and provisioned well enough that its defenders had every reason to believe they could simply wait out any siege indefinitely. Rather than attempting another daring cliff assault, Alexander turned this time to engineering and patience in roughly equal measure, having his own soldiers construct a rough timber bridge and ramp system across the ravine under difficult winter conditions, working in relays through snow and freezing temperatures that killed a number of his own men through exposure alone. A grinding, unglamorous labour that lacked the single dramatic climax of the earlier siege, but that steadily, visibly demonstrated to Chorines and his own garrison that the seemingly impossible chasm protecting them could, in fact, be crossed. Rather than wait for the completed assault, Chorines, watching the bridge inch closer to his own walls day by day, chose to negotiate, descending personally under safe conduct to meet with Alexander, and ultimately surrendering the fortress without further bloodshed in exchange for generous terms, keeping his own local authority intact under Alexander's wider rule. A resolution that Alexander, by several accounts, seems to have genuinely preferred, treating a bloodless surrender purchased through patient engineering and a credible show of force as every bit as satisfying a victory as a stormed and burning citadel, so long as the wider region came away pacified either way. The episode, less famous than the more theatrical rock at Sogdiana, but arguably more revealing of Alexander's actual operational range as a commander, shows a side of his generalship that the story of any single dramatic cliff assault can obscure, a willingness to grind through the patient, unglamorous work of engineering and negotiation when the situation called for it, rather than reaching, every single time, for the sword-through-the-knot solution that had already become his own signature, elephants at the river's edge. With Bactria and Sogdiana finally, if never entirely pacified, Alexander turned his restless attention still further east, crossing the Hindu Kush mountains and, in the spring of 326 before Christ, pushing his army across the Indus River into the Punjab region of what is now Pakistan, territory that lay at the very outer edge of anything the Greek geographical imagination had previously mapped with any confidence, and that Alexander himself appears to have genuinely believed, based on the incomplete and often wildly inaccurate geographical knowledge available to him, might represent something close to the eastern edge of the entire habitable world. He was welcomed as an ally by a local ruler named Taxiles, who saw in the Macedonian invasion a useful opportunity to settle old scores against a rival king, Porus, who ruled the territory beyond the river Hydaspes, and it was against Porus in the summer of that same year that Alexander fought what many military historians consider the most difficult and most tactically demanding battle of his entire career, crossing the swollen, monsoon-flooded Hydaspes River at night under difficult and dangerous conditions to outmaneuver Porus's own forces, which included, in addition to a substantial infantry and cavalry force, a line of some 200 war elephants, animals that Alexander's own Macedonian soldiers and horses had never before encountered in battle, and that presented a genuinely novel tactical problem no amount of prior experience against Persian armies had prepared them for. The elephants of Porus. It is worth pausing to actually picture what those 200 elephants meant to a Macedonian and Greek soldier who had never in his life seen one, an animal standing taller at the shoulder than any horse, weighing many times what the largest warhorse in the companion cavalry could carry, moving with a low, ground-shaking rumble that carried well before the animals themselves came into view, and trained to charge directly into a line of men and simply keep walking, trampling shields, spears, and soldiers alike with an indifference no cavalry charge, however terrifying, had ever quite managed to convey. Alexander's own horses, which had carried his cavalry through victory after victory against Persian riders and Persian infantry, balked and panicked at the animal's unfamiliar scent and size, refusing, in the first confused moments of the battle, to approach the Indian line at all, forcing Alexander to rely far more heavily than usual on his own infantry and light javelin throwers, who were given the specific and gruesome task of working in close, beneath the elephant's own reach, to kill or disable their mahouts. The individual handlers steering each animal from its back, since an elephant separated from its own trained handler, tended, within moments, to turn from a devastating weapon into a panicked, directionless danger to friend and enemy alike, wheeling in terror and trampling the very ranks of Indian soldiers it had been brought forward to protect. By the battle's final hour, several of the great animals lay dead or dying on the field alongside the human casualties, and the survivors, maddened by wounds and by the noise and chaos all around them, had become, by several ancient accounts, nearly as dangerous to Porus's own retreating soldiers as they had once been to Alexander's advancing line. A vivid, brutal illustration of exactly how quickly the most fearsome weapon on any ancient battlefield could turn, once its own controlling hand was lost, into simply one more source of chaos among many. The battle was hard fought and costly on both sides, Alexander's cavalry and light infantry working in careful, coordinated combination to isolate and gradually wear down the Indian elephants, whose handlers were systematically targeted and killed until the great animals, no longer under effective control, began to panic and trample as many of Porus's own soldiers as they did Macedonians. And when the battle finally ended in a hard-won Macedonian victory, Porus himself, wounded but unbowed, was brought before Alexander as a captive, and when asked how he wished to be treated, is said to have answered simply, and with a dignity that visibly impressed his conqueror, that he wished to be treated as a king treats a king, an answer that so struck Alexander that he not only spared Porus's life, but restored him to his own throne, and, in time, expanded his territory, forging an alliance rather than imposing the kind of outright subjugation that had followed so many of his other victories. It was also in the immediate aftermath of this battle that Alexander's own beloved warhorse Bucephalus, who had carried him through every major battle of the campaign since his boyhood taming of the animal back in Macedon, died, whether from wounds sustained in the fighting or, as some ancient sources suggest, simply from age and exhaustion after a lifetime of hard campaigning. And Alexander, in a gesture that reveals something genuine about the depth of his attachment to the animal, founded a new city on the site and named it Bucephala in the horse's honour, one more city among the dozens he would found and name across the length of his eastern conquests, but one carrying, uniquely among them, the name of a single, irreplaceable companion. Bucephalus was not, in fact, entirely alone in receiving that particular honour, because Alexander is also said to have kept a favourite hunting dog named Peritus, raised from a puppy and reportedly so devoted to its master that it once, according to one preserved story, fought off an attacking elephant to protect him. And when Peritus eventually died of old age, Alexander gave the animal a similarly grand send-off, naming a city after the dog as well, a small, quietly tender detail that sits, like so much else in this story, in genuine and uncomfortable contrast with the scale of human death. This same restless king left, scattered across 3 continents in the very same years, the army that finally said no. Beyond the Hydaspes, Alexander pushed his exhausted army still further east, toward the banks of the river Ephesus, driven by reports, whether accurate or wildly exaggerated by the time they reached him, of a still greater and still wealthier kingdom lying somewhere beyond it. And it was here, on the banks of that river, that Alexander finally encountered the one obstacle in his entire career that no amount of personal courage, tactical brilliance, or sheer force of will could overcome. His own army, exhausted by 8 years of continuous campaigning across thousands of miles, drenched for weeks by relentless monsoon rains that had rotted their equipment and their morale in equal measure, and increasingly convinced, after the hard-fought and costly battle against Porus, that whatever lay further east could only mean still larger kingdoms, still larger armies, and still more elephants waiting to be fought, simply refused to go any further. Alexander, by every ancient account, was genuinely stunned and genuinely furious at this resistance, gathering his officers and delivering what has come down to us as an impassioned speech, urging them onward towards still greater glory, and when even this failed to move his exhausted troops, retreating in a display of wounded royal petulance that several ancient sources record with evident astonishment, to his own tent for 3 full days, refusing to see anyone, in an apparent attempt to force his army's hand through sheer sulking royal displeasure rather than persuasion. It did not work. The army's spokesman in this crisis was Conus, one of Alexander's own senior and most respected generals, who is recorded as delivering a careful, measured speech arguing that the men had followed Alexander further than any Macedonian army had ever been asked to march, had won every battle he had ever asked them to fight, and deserved now, after 8 years away from their own homes, wives and children, the chance to enjoy the almost unimaginable wealth and glory they had already won rather than being driven onward, indefinitely, into an unknown and increasingly hostile world at the edge of everything any of them had ever known or understood, a speech that Conus is said to have delivered with visible personal risk to himself, given Alexander's own well-documented recent history of violent retaliation against officers who challenged him too directly. Whether it was Conus's speech specifically or simply the accumulated, unmistakable weight of an entire army's collective and unmovable will, Alexander, after his 3 days of isolated sulking, finally emerged and agreed, for the first and only time in his entire career, to turn back, ordering 12 enormous stone altars built on the riverbank to mark the furthest eastward extent of his own conquests, monuments to a border his empire would never actually cross, and beginning, at last, the long and difficult journey back toward the Persian heartland, a retreat that would prove, in its own way, nearly as costly and nearly as dangerous as any battle he had yet fought, an arrow through the ribs. On the long march back down the Indus toward the sea, Alexander's army encountered continued resistance from a number of the region's fiercely independent peoples, and the hardest fighting of this entire final Indian phase came against a people called the Mali, who had gathered a substantial force to resist the invasion and retreated when their initial defence collapsed behind the walls of a fortified town. Alexander, frustrated by what he judged to be excessive caution among his own scaling parties as they hesitated at the base of the wall under heavy missile fire, is said to have seized a ladder himself, climbed to the top of the wall alone or with only 2 or 3 companions immediately behind him, and, rather than wait for the rest of his own troops to follow, leapt down inside the town alone, placing his back against the wall and fighting off the gathering Mali defenders essentially single-handed for several desperate minutes before his own men, horrified at seeing their king isolated inside a hostile town, tore the wall apart in their frantic haste to reach him. In the fighting before help arrived, Alexander was struck by an arrow that punched through his breastplate and lodged deep in his chest, by most ancient accounts near or through the lung itself, a wound serious enough that he collapsed on the spot and had to be carried from the field, and the army, upon seeing its king go down, very nearly dissolved into panic. A wave of rumour racing back through the ranks that Alexander was already dead, a rumour so persistent and so damaging to morale that Alexander, still recovering and still in real physical danger, insisted on being carried down to the riverbank on a litter within days so that his own assembled troops could see with their own eyes that he was still breathing. And then, in a scene several ancient sources describe with evident awe, forced himself, against the urging of his own physicians, to mount a horse and ride slowly past the ranks so that the men lining the riverbank could reach out and touch his leg, his hand, the hem of his cloak weeping with relief as he passed. A display of sheer physical will from a man who had very nearly died days earlier that did as much to restore the army's shaken confidence as any victory in open battle ever had. The wound itself never fully healed in the ordinary sense, several ancient sources noting that Alexander suffered lasting pain and weakness in the area for the remainder of his life. One more accumulated injury layered on top of the 2 years of continuous campaigning, drinking, and grief still to come, and modern historians assessing the causes of his eventual death in Babylon have more than once wondered aloud whether a body that had absorbed this much physical damage by the age of 30 was already, quietly, running out of road well before the fever that finally killed him ever took hold. A contest of philosophers. Somewhere along this same stretch of the Indian campaign, Alexander's own well-documented curiosity about the wider intellectual world led him to seek out a group of Indian ascetic philosophers, the same tradition of naked gymnosophists that would later give the Greek court Calanus and the story that survives, whether embellished by later retelling or reasonably close to whatever conversation actually took place, describes Alexander posing each philosopher in turn a deliberately difficult riddle, promising death to whoever answered worst and rewards to whoever answered best. Questions ranging from which is more numerous, the living or the dead, to which came first, day or night, to how a man might best make himself loved, each philosopher answering in turn with the same kind of deliberately paradoxical, faintly mocking cleverness. Greek writers love to attribute to exotic Eastern sages, one reportedly answering that the living are more numerous because the dead no longer exist and therefore cannot be counted at all. Another that a man makes himself most loved by being powerful without being feared. A piece of advice. Alexander, whatever he made of it in the moment, does not appear to have taken to heart with any particular consistency across the rest of his own career. Whatever the historical reliability of the exchange itself, it captures something genuine about Alexander's own restless intellectual curiosity. A king who carried not only soldiers and siege engines across Asia, but a standing retinue of historians, geographers, botanists, and philosophers commissioned specifically to observe, record and puzzle over everything the expedition encountered, an entourage that included the historian Onesicritus, who would later write his own controversial and much doubted account of the campaign, and that reflected in its own quiet way the lasting influence of Aristotle's own restless curiosity on the pupil he had once tutored beneath the covered walkways of Mieza, a desert that ate an army. Rather than retracing the same route his army had taken on the way out, Alexander divided his forces for the return journey, sending a portion of his troops and the bulk of his baggage and camp followers by a safer inland route, while he himself led a substantial detachment along the coast of the Gedrosian Desert, in what is now southern Pakistan and Iran, a decision driven partly by a genuine desire to explore and map previously unknown territory, and partly by some ancient accounts, by a personal determination to succeed, where a legendary earlier conqueror, the semi-mythical Assyrian queen Semiramis, was said to have failed catastrophically, attempting the very same crossing centuries before. It proved to be one of the single greatest miscalculations of Alexander's entire career. the army marching for some 60 days through a landscape of shifting sand dunes, scorching daytime heat, bitterly cold nights, and almost no reliable water or food. Conditions that killed soldiers, camp followers, pack animals, and, by several ancient accounts, an unknown but clearly substantial number of the women and children who had, over 8 years of campaigning, attached themselves to the army as its own travelling community. The exact death toll of the Gedrosian crossing has never been reliably established, and it is worth naming honestly, as this channel has learned to do again and again across its own long history of telling stories like this one, that the ancient sources themselves focused overwhelmingly on the fate of Alexander's core fighting force, simply did not bother to carefully count the merchants, the slaves, the wives, the children, and the camp followers who died alongside the soldiers in that desert. A silence that tells us, in its own way, exactly whose deaths the ancient world considered worth recording and whose deaths it did not. And modern historians, working from the surviving fragments and comparing them against the scale of the army that entered the desert, against the scale of the army that emerged from the other side of it, have generally concluded that the losses were catastrophic, quite possibly exceeding, in raw numbers, the combined casualties of every major pitched battle Alexander had fought across the entire preceding 8 years of continuous warfare. Alexander himself, by every account, shared fully in the hardship of the march, famously refusing, when offered a rare helmet full of water found by a scouting party at a moment when his own men were dying of thirst all around him, to drink it himself, pouring it out onto the sand in full view of his suffering troops, rather than accept for himself a comfort he could not extend to every soldier under his command, a gesture of genuine solidarity that his surviving men, by several accounts, never forgot, even as the desert around them continued indifferently to kill their comrades by the hundreds. The fleet along the coast, Alexander's own catastrophic land crossing of the Gedrosian desert, was not the only leg of the journey home, because while the king led one column along the coastal desert, he had ordered his admiral Nearchus, a Cretan companion who had grown up alongside him since childhood, to lead the fleet itself along the coastline by sea, exploring and charting a stretch of ocean shore that no Greek ship had ever previously sailed. A voyage that proved nearly as harrowing in its own way as Alexander's own desert crossing. Nearchus's sailors battling unfamiliar tides, unpredictable monsoon winds, hostile fish-eating coastal tribes the Greeks had no prior name for and simply called ichthyophagoi, meaning fish-eaters, and long stretches of barren coastline offering neither fresh water nor food, conditions that came close, more than once by Nearchus's own later written account, to destroying the fleet entirely before it finally reached the safety of the Persian Gulf and reunited with Alexander's own battered land forces, bringing with it a wealth of genuinely new geographical and navigational knowledge about a stretch of the Indian Ocean coastline that would not be charted again in comparable detail by any European power for well over 1,000 years afterward, the reckoning at Opis. Alexander finally emerged from the Gedrosian desert and made his way back to the heartland of his new empire, reuniting with the rest of his scattered forces and beginning, with characteristic energy, to address the considerable administrative chaos that had accumulated across the empire during his years of absence in the east, discovering, among other problems, that a number of the satraps and local governors he had left in charge of various provinces had used his prolonged absence to enrich themselves through corruption, abuse of the local population, or outright insubordination, and Alexander, moving with the same ruthless efficiency he had always applied to any perceived threat to his own authority, had several of the worst offenders tried and executed. But the most serious crisis of these final years arrived at the city of Opis, on the Tigris River, where Alexander announced his intention to send home a substantial portion of his older and wounded Macedonian veterans, replacing them in the ranks with newly trained Persian soldiers who had, over the preceding years, been drilled in Macedonian tactics and equipped with Macedonian weapons as part of Alexander's ongoing fusion policy, an announcement that his own Macedonian soldiers received, not with the relief and gratitude Alexander appears to have genuinely expected, but with open, furious mutiny, the men shouting that Alexander should simply go and conquer the rest of the world with his father Ammon, a bitter, sarcastic reference to his claimed divine parentage, since he plainly no longer had any need of the ordinary Macedonian soldiers who had actually won him his empire. Alexander's response to the mutiny at Opis was as swift and as characteristically theatrical as every other major crisis of his career, personally arresting and executing the 13 ringleaders of the unrest on the spot, and then, in a masterstroke of political and emotional pressure, announcing that he would simply dismiss his entire Macedonian army altogether and staff his court and his future campaigns entirely with Persian troops, a threat that broke the mutiny within a single day. His own veteran soldiers, faced with the genuine prospect of being permanently discarded in favour of the very Persians they had spent years being asked to accept as comrades, begging forgiveness outside his tent for 2 full days until Alexander finally relented, staged a public reconciliation banquet attended, by the more idealistic ancient accounts, by 9,000 men from every nation now represented in his sprawling multi-ethnic army, and offered a formal prayer, whether sincerely felt or carefully calculated for its propaganda value, for harmony and partnership between Macedonians and Persians in the government of the empire they now shared. It was around this same period that Alexander staged the single most dramatic public expression of his entire fusion policy, a mass wedding at Susa, in which he himself married 2 Persian princesses, and some 80 to 90 of his own senior Macedonian officers were married, in a single lavish state-organised ceremony, to Persian noblewomen, a genuinely ambitious attempt to bind the Macedonian and Persian ruling classes together through direct dynastic intermarriage on a scale no conqueror before or after him would ever again attempt. The Susa ceremony itself staged with the same theatrical grandeur Alexander brought to nearly every major public event of his reign. Paired specific, named couples in a way the surviving sources took evident care to record, Alexander himself marrying Statera, the eldest daughter of the dead Darius, in a gesture that formally, symbolically united his own line with the Achaemenid royal house he had spent 8 years dismantling, while his closest friend Hephaestion married Statera's own younger sister Drypetis, a match Alexander is said to have arranged quite deliberately, so that his own future children and Hephaestion's own future children would be, in the most literal biological sense, first cousins, a detail that speaks volumes about exactly how completely Alexander wished to bind his own inner circle together, by blood as well as by loyalty, even as the marriage would, within the year, be cut short by Hephaestion's own sudden death before any children of that union were ever born. It is worth noting, honestly, that the marriages themselves proved considerably less durable than Alexander's own political vision for them, with the overwhelming majority of his Macedonian officers quietly divorcing or abandoning their new Persian wives within a very short time of Alexander's own death, when the political pressure that had produced the marriages in the first place simply evaporated along with the king who had insisted on them. Alongside the mass demobilization announced at Opis, Alexander made one further administrative decision, whose interrupted execution would go on to matter a great deal in the chaos still to come, ordering his own trusted senior general Craterus, a Macedonian officer whose steady, old-fashioned loyalty to traditional Macedonian custom had made him a natural favourite of the very veterans now being sent home, to lead the discharged soldiers back to Macedon and to take up the regency there in Antipater's own place, while Antipater himself was summoned east to Asia with a fresh levy of replacement troops, a swap that would have quietly and non-violently resolved the long, bitter tension between Antipater and Olympias by simply removing Antipater from Macedon altogether. Craterus had only reached Cilicia, still well short of Macedon itself, when news of Alexander's death in Babylon reached him, and the planned handover, never completed, left Antipater still firmly in place as regent, still locked in his old feud with Olympias, and now answering to no single authority at all beyond his own judgment, and the shifting, uncertain consensus of the other successors One more example of exactly how much of the chaos that followed Alexander's death traces back not to any grand design, but to ordinary administrative business, already in motion, that his sudden death simply left permanently, awkwardly unfinished. The men who carried the spears. Behind every named battle and every named general in this story stood tens of thousands of ordinary Macedonian and Greek infantrymen whose own individual names have almost entirely vanished from the historical record. Men who had signed on, or in many cases been conscripted, for what most of them originally understood to be a relatively short campaign of revenge against Persia, and who found themselves instead marching further and further from home, year after year, into territories whose names they had never heard growing up in their own Macedonian villages. Their pay, while genuinely generous by the standards of the ancient Mediterranean world, especially once the Persian treasuries began pouring silver and gold into Alexander's own hands, came bundled with a share of plunder from captured cities that could, for a fortunate and violent few, amount to a life-changing fortune. And it was this combination of steady wages and the constant glittering promise of sudden riches that kept a citizen army willing to keep marching years, past the point where any ordinary campaign would long since have ended and sent them home to their farms. Across the length of the campaign, Alexander founded, by most modern counts, somewhere between 20 and 30 new cities, bearing variations of his own name, many of them seeded quite deliberately with veteran soldiers too old, too wounded, or simply judged too useful as a garrison to continue marching further east. Men left behind, often against their own clearly expressed wishes, to hold a distant frontier fortress in Bactria or Sogdiana, while the rest of the army marched on without them, forced to build entirely new lives, and in many cases entirely new families with local Asian wives, in places about as far from Macedonian soil, in both distance and culture, as it was possible for an ancient soldier to be sent. The resentment this policy produced among the men left behind never fully went away, and it broke into open violence more than once. Years before Alexander's own death, false rumours that he had been killed fighting deep in India reached the veteran garrisons scattered across Bactria, prompting a large-scale mutiny among the homesick settlers, who gathered arms and supplies and attempted to simply march themselves back to Greece without waiting for any official permission, an uprising that was eventually suppressed once the rumours of Alexander's death proved false, though not without real bloodshed among men who had, in their own minds, done nothing more than try to go home. And when Alexander did finally die in Babylon, the very same grievance exploded again, on a much larger and far more tragic scale, in what later historians came to call the Revolt of the Greek Exiles. Tens of thousands of veteran settlers across the eastern satrapies, hearing that the king who had planted them so far from home was now genuinely and permanently gone, rose up en masse and attempted once more to march back toward Greece, only to be intercepted, defeated in open battle by the forces of the regent Perdiccas, and, in the final grim accounting, largely slaughtered or forced back into the very garrison towns they had risked everything trying to leave, a bitter, largely forgotten postscript to Alexander's own glittering conquests, and a reminder, as this channel has learned to offer again and again across so many other stories, that the ordinary men who actually do the marching and the dying in any great conqueror's story rarely get to choose, in the end, where they are finally allowed to rest. Around this same final period of his life, Alexander appears to have sent a formal request, or by some ancient accounts something closer to an instruction, back to the mainland Greek cities of the League of Corinth, asking that he be granted the honours due to a god, a request that produced, across a Greek political culture already uneasy about the whole trajectory of his reign, a mixture of resigned compliance and open, biting sarcasm. Several cities complied, voting Alexander cult status and establishing shrines and priesthoods in his honour, whether out of genuine religious conviction, simple political prudence, or some uneasy mixture of both, while the orator Demosthenes, addressing the Athenian assembly on the question with the same rhetorical bite, that had made him Philip's own most persistent critic a generation earlier, is said to have remarked, with heavy irony, that Alexander could be the son of Zeus, and of Poseidon too if he liked, a line that drew laughter precisely because everyone present understood it as pointed mockery dressed up as agreement. The Spartans, always the driest and most economical of the Greek city-states in matters of formal debate, are said to have replied to the request with a single sentence of magnificent brevity: "Since Alexander wishes to be a god, let him be a god," a response that managed, in a handful of words, to grant the formal request while making unmistakably clear exactly how much genuine reverence lay behind it. Alexander himself, by every indication, took the whole controversy with less personal investment than the fury it provoked back in Greece might suggest, treating the question of his own divinity, as he so often treated questions of Persian court ceremony and Egyptian pharaonic titles before it, less as a matter of sincere personal belief than as one more tool, useful in some places and unnecessary in others, for managing the loyalty of a genuinely vast and genuinely diverse empire that no single, uniform political idea could ever have held together on its own. That same final year produced one further political intervention that rattled the Greek world nearly as much as the divinity question, when Alexander issued what came to be known as the Exiles' Decree, a sweeping proclamation, read aloud to assembled Greek representatives at the Olympic Games in the summer of 324 before Christ, ordering every Greek city to permit its own political exiles, men driven from their homes over the preceding decades by war, revolution, or simple factional grudge, to return and reclaim their property, an order Alexander appears to have intended partly as a genuine humanitarian gesture, and partly as a calculated way of destabilizing potential troublemakers by flooding restless cities with returning exiles who owed their restoration directly to him rather than to their own local politics. The decree landed hardest on Athens, which had spent the previous decades settling Athenian citizens on the nearby island of Samos after expelling its original population, and which now faced the prospect of Alexander's own order forcing them to hand the island back, a demand so unwelcome that Athenian envoys spent the following months in increasingly desperate and ultimately unsuccessful diplomatic efforts to have Samos specifically exempted, a small but genuinely telling illustration of exactly how far Alexander's own personal authority had come to override even the internal affairs of a city that had, only a dozen years earlier, been treated as a nominally free and independent partner in his father's own League of Corinth, rather than a subject simply required to comply. It was around this same general period, as the army rested and reorganised in the Persian heartland, that Alexander's court lost another figure whose death, though far less politically consequential than the one still to come, left a genuinely strange and lasting impression on everyone who witnessed it. Among the philosophers, holy men, and curiosities Alexander had collected around his own court during the Indian campaign was an elderly ascetic teacher the Greeks called Calenus, one of a group of Indian philosophers known to the Greeks as gymnosophists, or naked wise men, for their practice of renouncing clothing and worldly possessions entirely, and Calenus, having fallen seriously ill and judging, according to his own philosophical tradition, that a deliberately chosen death was preferable to a slow physical decline, announced his intention to end his own life by climbing onto a funeral pyre while still alive and allowing himself to be burned. Alexander, by several accounts genuinely troubled by the decision, tried repeatedly to talk him out of it, and when persuasion failed, arranged an elaborate public ceremony befitting the philosopher's own wishes, complete with a procession, sacrifices, and the assembled ranks of the army itself standing witness, and Calenus is said to have climbed onto the pyre without visible fear or hesitation, embracing several of his own Macedonian friends in farewell, but declining to embrace Alexander himself, promising instead, in a line the ancient sources preserve with evident relish for its eerie, prophetic weight, that the two of them would meet again soon in Babylon, a promise that Alexander, dying in that very city less than a year later, would have had every reason in his own final delirious days to remember: the death of the second self. Amid all of this political manoeuvring, Alexander suffered, in the final year of his life, a personal loss that appears, by every surviving account, to have affected him more deeply than any military setback, any mutiny, or any political crisis of his entire career, when his closest friend, and by the strong implication of several ancient sources, quite possibly his lover Hephaestion, died suddenly of a fever at the city of Ecbatana, a death that plunged Alexander into a grief so extreme and so prolonged that even his own contemporaries, well accustomed by then to their king's capacity for intense emotion, found it genuinely alarming. Hephaestion had been Alexander's companion since their shared boyhood under Aristotle's own tutelage. The man Alexander had once, at the tent of Darius's captured family, pointedly declared to be, in effect, his own second self, and the two had remained close, in a relationship the ancient sources describe with a mixture of admiration and evident discomfort across every stage of the entire Eastern campaign, so that Hephaestion's sudden death left Alexander, by multiple accounts, prostrate with grief for days, refusing food, cutting his own hair short in an act of mourning that deliberately echoed Achilles' own grief for the fallen Patroclus in Homer's ancient epic, ordering the physician who had failed to save Hephaestion crucified, and commissioning a funeral of such staggering, unprecedented extravagance, including a funeral pyre reportedly designed on a scale and at a cost that rivaled the construction of an entire small city, that it drained resources and provoked genuine unease even among Alexander's own most loyal remaining officers. It is worth pausing on the depth and the visibility of this particular grief, because it offers one of the clearest windows this entire story has into the private emotional life of a man who spent so much of his public career carefully managing exactly how the wider world perceived him, a man capable, as we have already seen again and again, of extraordinary calculation, even in his most seemingly spontaneous gestures of mercy or generosity, and yet a man who, when confronted with the sudden death of the one person who had known him since childhood, before any of the titles, before any of the conquests, before the oracle at Siwa and the whispers of divine parentage had ever entered into how the world understood him, appears to have simply and completely broken down, unable, for the only clearly documented time in his entire adult life, to perform his own usual role of composed superhuman royal command. Alexander himself, by several accounts, never fully recovered his previous vitality in the months that followed Hephaestion's death, and some later historians, looking back across the full arc of his final year, have wondered openly whether the grief itself, compounding an already exhausted body worn down by 11 years of continuous campaigning, wounds and heavy drinking, played some real part in hastening the illness that would, within a matter of months, claim Alexander's own life as well. Alexander went further still in the months after Hephaestion's death, sending envoys all the way back to the oracle at Siwa, the same remote desert sanctuary that had once left his own claim to divine parentage so carefully unresolved, to ask formal permission to honour Hephaestion's memory with the status of a hero, a semi-divine rank below full godhood but well above ordinary mortal remembrance, and the oracle, whether swayed by Alexander's own now considerable influence, or by whatever genuine religious logic Ammon's priests applied to the question, granted it, so that shrines to Hephaestion as a hero were established in various cities across the empire in the months that followed, one more elaborate, expensive, and only partially successful attempt by a grieving king to make a single irreplaceable loss somehow permanent and official, when nothing in his own life by that point had ever actually managed to stay still long enough to become permanent at all. Plans for a world not yet conquered. In the months following Hephaestion's death, even as his own grief remained visibly unresolved, Alexander threw himself into planning his next campaign, with an energy that suggests a man trying, deliberately or not, to outrun his own sorrow through sheer forward motion, and the ambitions recorded by later writers claiming access to his court papers, whatever their precise reliability, describe a scope of planning that dwarfed even the 12 years of conquest already behind him. The immediate objective was a naval expedition against the Arabian Peninsula, a wealthy trading region Alexander's own geographers believed incorrectly might represent an island roughly the size of India itself, and preparations were already well underway. New harbours dredged at Babylon, a fleet under construction when his illness finally struck. But the plans recorded by the historian Diodorus, drawing on documents said to have been presented to the army after Alexander's death, and then deliberately shelved by his own successors as too vast and too costly to seriously pursue, describe an even more staggering ambition still further out on the horizon, a campaign along the North African coast to conquer Carthage, the great Phoenician trading power that would, a century and a half later, fight Rome itself to a standstill across 3 brutal wars in a story this channel has had occasion to tell elsewhere, followed by a march along the coast of Spain and southern Gaul, and a return to Macedon through Italy, a route that would have carried Alexander's own army directly through the territory of a still modest, still provincial Italian city-state that had not yet begun its own long climb toward Mediterranean dominance, a city called Rome, a collision between the ancient world's 2 greatest military traditions that a restless mind can wonder about for a very long time, and that history, because Alexander never boarded a single ship for Arabia, let alone Carthage, was never actually required to settle. 11 days in Babylon. In the weeks before Alexander's final return to the city, a group of Chaldean priests, whose accumulated centuries of Babylonian astrological learning Alexander had always treated with genuine careful respect, are said to have sent urgent warning that he should not enter Babylon at all, or if he must, that he should enter it facing east rather than from the west, a warning Alexander, delayed by marshy ground and impassable terrain along his intended route, ultimately found impossible to fully honour, entering the city in the end from precisely the direction the priests had cautioned against. Stranger omens followed once he was inside the walls. A common soldier, found wandering the palace in a fit of apparent madness, was discovered sitting alone on Alexander's own royal throne, wearing the king's own robe and crown, having simply walked past the palace guards unchallenged, an incident the courtiers judged deeply inauspicious, and that rattled Alexander enough that he had the man interrogated at length, though nothing resembling an organised conspiracy was ever uncovered behind it. And in the final days before the fever finally took hold, Alexander's own signet ring, the very ring that would soon be pressed into another man's hand at his own deathbed, is said to have slipped from his finger and fallen into the Euphrates while he crossed the river by boat, an accident several ancient writers could not resist recording as one more small, ominous thread in the tightening pattern of a story that by that point everyone retelling it already knew was rushing toward its own ending. Alexander returned to Babylon in the spring of 323 before Christ, already, by that point, planning his next campaign, an ambitious naval expedition against the Arabian Peninsula that would, by his own restless standard, have been merely the first step towards still further conquests he never lived to properly articulate. And it was there, after a period of what several ancient sources describe as increasingly heavy drinking and an exhausting schedule of banquets, diplomatic receptions and administrative business, that he fell ill in late May or early June of that year with a fever that would not break. The ancient accounts of his final illness, preserved in what survives of the so-called royal diaries kept by his own court officials, describe a slow, grinding decline across roughly 10 or 11 days, fever alternating with periods of apparent lucidity, a gradual loss of the ability to speak, and finally, in the early days of June, death, at not yet 33 years old, in the very city that had, only a few years earlier, opened its gates to him as the new master of Asia. What actually killed Alexander has never been established with any real confidence, and it is one of the enduring, genuinely unresolved mysteries of ancient history that this channel has learned, across so many other long nights, to sit with honestly rather than paper over with full certainty. Ancient rumour, almost from the moment of his death, favoured poison, with suspicion falling variously on Antipater, the general Alexander had left in charge of Macedon during his years away, and with whom his relationship had grown increasingly strained, or on a wider conspiracy among officers, uneasy about where his endless campaigning might lead them next, though no ancient source offers anything approaching solid evidence for any specific poisoning theory, and the symptoms described in the surviving royal diaries, a prolonged fever lasting well over a week, do not obviously match the action of any poison known to the ancient world, most of which killed considerably faster. Modern medical historians, working backward from the same fragmentary descriptions, have proposed a genuinely wide range of alternative explanations across the decades: malaria, typhoid fever, a bacterial infection related to injuries or old battlefield wounds, complications from years of heavy alcohol consumption, and, in one more recent and unusually specific theory that attracted considerable public attention, a rare autoimmune condition called Guillain-Barré syndrome, which some researchers have argued could explain both the prolonged illness and a detail preserved in some of the more sensational later accounts, suggesting that Alexander's body showed no visible signs of decomposition for several days after his apparent death, a claim modern doctors have suggested might actually reflect a form of paralysis so complete that Alexander was, in fact, still alive, and simply unable to move or speak, for some period after he had already been declared dead by those around him, a possibility too disturbing to dwell on for very long, and one we can never, at this distance, either confirm or rule out. What we do know, because multiple independent ancient sources agree on it, even where they disagree on almost everything else, is the scene that this whole long story opened with tonight, the desperate final question from his gathered officers about who should inherit his throne, and the answer to the strongest or the alternative tradition of a foreseen funeral contest, either version leaving behind, quite deliberately, or through simple physical inability to say anything more coherent, no actual named successor at all, no clear plan for how an empire stretching from Greece to India, built entirely around the singular, irreplaceable person of one restless, brilliant, increasingly untouchable young king, was supposed to continue functioning without him. It is, in the end, the single most consequential silence in this entire story, a silence that would prove, within a remarkably short span of time, to be the true and lasting legacy of a man who had spent his entire adult life cutting through every obstacle placed in front of him with the same decisive, sword-through-the-knot certainty, and who left behind, at the very last and most important moment of his own extraordinary life, no answer at all. Both hands held open at once. Before this story follows Alexander's empire into the long, bloody scramble that consumed it in the years immediately after his death, it is worth pausing to hold, deliberately and honestly, the two genuinely contradictory pictures of this man that this whole long night has been quietly assembling all along, because Alexander refuses more completely than almost any other figure this channel has ever told you about, to settle comfortably into either the role of hero or the role of monster, and any honest telling of his life has to hold both of those pictures open at once, rather than collapsing gratefully into one or the other. On one hand sits the Alexander of genuine, extraordinary vision, a young king who founded upward of 20 cities across 3 continents, many of which, Alexandria in Egypt chief among them, would go on to become genuine centres of learning, trade, and culture for centuries, and, in Alexandria's case, for millennia after his own death, who pursued, whatever its ultimate limitations and its ultimate failures, once he was no longer alive to enforce it personally, a genuinely ambitious policy of cultural fusion rather than simple domination, who spared and honoured a defeated enemy's family with a consistency that went well beyond mere political calculation, who wept, apparently sincerely, over the body of a rival king betrayed by his own men, and who mourned the death of his closest friend with a grief so total it frightened the hardened soldiers around him. On the other hand sits the Alexander who ordered 30,000 Thebans, a great many of them people with no personal role whatsoever in any decision to revolt, sold into slavery and their entire city razed to the ground as an act of calculated political terror, who crucified 2,000 captured men along the shore of Tyre and enslaved tens of thousands more, who burned the palace complex and quite possibly a considerable portion of the ordinary living city of Persepolis in what may have been nothing more than a fit of drunken theatre, who murdered a man who had once saved his own life in a jealous, drunken rage over a dinner-table insult, and then sought philosophical comfort rather than genuine accountability for it, who had his own court historian tortured to death over a matter of court ceremony, and who drove an army, and an unknown but almost certainly enormous number of the ordinary women, children, and camp followers attached to it, into a desert crossing that appears to have killed more people than several of his major battles combined, a catastrophe born not of military necessity, but of personal ambition to succeed, where a half-legendary queen was said to have failed centuries before. Neither of these two Alexanders is the false one, and neither cancels the other out. They were, by every honest reading the surviving evidence allows, the very same man, operating according to the very same restless, absolute, and almost entirely unchecked will, and the discomfort of holding both of those truths in mind at once, rather than resolving them into a simpler story of pure genius or pure tyranny, is, in the end, probably the most honest tribute this particular life actually deserves. And sitting somewhere between these two extremes, neither fully redeeming the darker Alexander, nor fully damning the more visionary one, is the fusion policy itself, the marriages at Susa, the Persian troops trained and incorporated into the army, the deliberate blending of Macedonian and Achaemenid court culture that so alienated his own oldest companions, because that policy was, in the most literal sense, imposed, rather than chosen by nearly everyone forced to live inside it. 80 Macedonian officers married to Persian noblewomen, not because they had fallen in love, but because their king commanded a mass wedding and expected compliance. Thousands of Persian youths drilled in Macedonian tactics, not because they had chosen a Macedonian future for themselves, but because a foreign conqueror decided their own sons should fight his wars. A vision of unity that looked, from Alexander's own restless and genuinely far-sighted perspective, like the blueprint for a lasting blended civilization, and that looked, from the position of nearly everyone actually required to live inside that blueprint, like one more decision made for them by a king who had never once, across his entire life, shown much patience for being told no. For all of this, and it is a genuine puzzle that deserves its own honest attention rather than easy dismissal, Alexander's own ordinary soldiers, the very men whose lives his ambition spent so freely, remained by every account extraordinarily loyal to him across nearly the entire span of his reign, weeping at his bedside, mutinying not to overthrow him, but to be allowed to go home under his continued blessing, and filing past his deathbed in that same silent column this story opened with. Part of the answer lies in the plain, practical generosity he showed them, the shared plunder, the donatives, the promoted careers available to a talented common soldier under Alexander, in a way they simply were not under most other ancient commanders, but a considerable part of it appears to have been something less transactional than that, a genuine gift. Whatever else can be said about the man, for making individual soldiers feel personally seen by their king. Ancient writers preserve story after story of Alexander learning and using the names of ordinary men in the ranks, visiting wounded soldiers personally after battles to examine their injuries and hear how each wound had been earned, and sharing, again and again across 12 years, in the same hunger, the same thirst, the same freezing mountain passes and burning desert sand that every common soldier endured, most vividly in the moment already described in the Gedrusian desert when he poured away, in full view of his own dying men, the single helmet of water he could easily have kept for himself alone. A king who murdered a friend in a drunken rage and tortured a historian to death over a matter of court ceremony, was also, somehow in the very same body, a king whose own soldiers wept at the mere sight of him lying ill, and reconciling those two facts is not a puzzle. This story can solve any more cleanly than it could solve the destruction of Thebes sitting beside the mercy shown to Timoclea, except to notice, honestly, that extraordinary charisma and extraordinary cruelty have never been, in any century, mutually exclusive qualities in the men history remembers as great. The uncounted dead of Alexander's own wars. It is worth doing, for Alexander's own campaigns, something this channel has tried to do for so many other conquerors and conquests across its long history, which is to resist the easy narrative pull of battle names and victory counts long enough to ask, directly, how many people actually died across the full span of this one man's 12 years of continuous warfare, and to admit, honestly, that no confident final number has ever existed and almost certainly never will. The great set-piece battles alone, Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, the Hydaspes, and a dozen smaller engagements besides, likely cost by the most careful modern estimates drawn from fragmentary and frequently self-serving ancient casualty figures, somewhere in the range of several tens of thousands of soldiers' lives on the Macedonian and Allied side alone, and considerably more by every ancient account's own admission on the Persian and Indian side, where the ancient sources, writing overwhelmingly from the Macedonian perspective, had far less interest in careful, sympathetic counting. Beyond the name battles lie the sieges, Thebes, Tyre, Gaza, the countless smaller fortified towns and mountain strongholds of Bactria and Sogdiana, where civilian populations were killed, enslaved or scattered in numbers, the surviving sources record only unevenly and often with visible pride, rather than any impulse toward careful documentation, and beyond even the sieges lies the slower, quieter, and almost entirely uncounted toll of disease, exhaustion, exposure, and simple attrition that accompanied any ancient army on the march for as many consecutive years as Alexander's own force endured, a toll that reached, we know, from the one clearly documented catastrophe of the Gedrosian desert, genuinely staggering proportions among soldiers and camp followers alike. And beneath all of these categories lies a final, permanently unanswerable accounting that this channel has, across so many stories now, learned to expect and to name honestly, rather than pretend does not exist. The ordinary Persian, Bactrian, Sogdian, and Indian farmers, craftsmen and townspeople who never appear in any surviving ancient account by name, who fought in no named battle and were besieged in no named city, but whose villages were burned, whose crops were requisitioned to feed a foreign army passing through, and whose lives were simply upended, and in an unknown but almost certainly very large number of cases ended, by the passage of the largest and most sustained military campaign the ancient world had yet seen, a toll that no ancient chronicler writing to celebrate the glory of a conquering king rather than to mourn his victims ever thought worth carefully totalling, and that no modern historian, working from the same incomplete and heavily biased sources, has ever been able to fully recover. Macedon itself paid its own quiet demographic price for its king's 12 years of continuous conquest, a cost the ancient sources, fixated as ever on battles won and cities founded, rarely paused to tally directly. Modern historians estimating the total number of Macedonian citizens who marched east with Alexander, and in the reinforcement drafts that followed him across the following decade have suggested figures reaching into the tens of thousands, drawn from a kingdom whose entire free citizen population, by the most careful modern estimates, likely numbered somewhere in the range of a few 100,000 people at most, meaning a genuinely significant share of an entire generation of Macedonian men of fighting age spent the whole of their 20s and 30s thousands of miles from home, many of them never returning at all, whether killed in battle, lost to disease and exhaustion, or simply settled permanently into garrison towns scattered across 3 continents, a demographic drain some modern historians have pointed to as one quiet, underappreciated factor in Macedon's own gradual decline as an independent great power across the century that followed Alexander's death. A kingdom that had, in the most literal sense, spent an entire generation of its own sons conquering an empire it would prove unable, in the end, to hold on to for even half a century. How do we know this? Before this story follows Alexander's empire into its final, chaotic unravelling, it deserves an honest accounting of exactly whose eyes we have been seeing this whole story through, because the sources for Alexander's life present a set of problems even more severe, in some respects, than the sources for so many of the other lives this channel has told across its history. No account written during Alexander's own lifetime, or by anyone who actually marched with him, survives today in its original complete form, a genuinely striking gap given how thoroughly documented on the surface this particular life appears to be. Callisthenes' own official court history, the very account Alexander himself commissioned to shape how the Greek world would understand his campaign in real time, ends abruptly, unfinished, at the point of his own execution, and survives today only in scattered fragments quoted by later writers. 2 other contemporaries who actually served with Alexander, the general Ptolemy, who would go on to found his own royal dynasty in Egypt, and a companion named Aristobulus. Both wrote their own memoirs of the campaign decades after Alexander's death, and both accounts, while generally considered more reliable than most of what survives, were written by men with obvious personal and political incentives to present their own roles, and Alexander's own character, in a favourable light. Ptolemy in particular, writing as the reigning king of a new dynasty that badly needed Alexander's own legacy to appear as glorious and as legitimate as possible, the accounts that have actually come down to us in anything like complete readable form were all written centuries after Alexander's own death, drawing on these lost earlier sources at varying and often uncertain removes. The Greek historian Arrian, writing in the 2nd century after Christ, and generally regarded by modern historians as the single most reliable surviving account, precisely because he explicitly relied on Ptolemy and Aristobulus as his primary sources, while still writing, and this bears remembering, more than 400 years after the events themselves. The biographer Plutarch, writing around the same period and working within his own distinctive literary tradition of structured moral comparison between paired Greek and Roman lives, a tradition that shaped which anecdotes he chose to preserve and which he let fade away. The Sicilian historian Diodorus Siculus, whose account preserves valuable detail found nowhere else, but who is generally considered less careful and less critical of his own sources than Arrian. The Roman writer Quintus Curtius Rufus, whose vivid, dramatic, occasionally almost novelistic account has proven genuinely useful to historians precisely because of details it preserves that other sources omit, even as its overall reliability remains a matter of ongoing scholarly debate. And the Roman historian Justin, whose surviving work is itself only a later abridgment of an even earlier now-lost history by Pompeius Trogus. Layered on top of all of these more or less historically grounded accounts, and complicating the picture still further, is an entirely separate and far more fantastical literary tradition known collectively as the Alexander Romance, a body of legendary material that began accumulating almost immediately after Alexander's own death, and that grew across the following 1500 years into one of the most widely translated and endlessly reworked story cycles in the whole of world literature, spreading in dozens of languages across Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia and beyond, and attaching to Alexander's name adventures, monsters and magical journeys that have essentially nothing to do with the actual historical campaign this story has just spent so many hours walking through. A reminder, as honest and as necessary here as it has been in so many other stories this channel has told, that the historical Alexander and the legendary Alexander began diverging from one another almost from the very moment of his death, and have never, in the 2,300 years since, fully come back together again. Even the title by which this story has called him, all night Alexander the Great, was not something contemporaries actually called him during his own lifetime. No surviving inscription, no contemporary coin, no letter from the man himself uses any such formal epithet, and the addition of great to his name appears, as best modern scholars can trace it, to be a later convention, showing up first in securely dated form in Latin sources written by Roman playwrights and historians a century or more after his death, borrowed by a Roman world that had begun measuring its own rising generals, Pompey chief among them, against exactly the standard Alexander's own posthumous reputation had come to represent. The Greek world of his own lifetime knew him more simply as king as the son of Philip, or, among the more sceptical or more hostile, simply by name without any embellishment at all, and this deep into a very long night built entirely around that later, grander title. It bears remembering that the man who actually lived this story never once, so far as any surviving record shows, heard himself called the Great by anyone standing in front of him. A title assembled instead, gradually, by 2,000 years of retelling exactly the way so much else about this particular life was built. The way later centuries have chosen to tell this story has shifted too, in ways worth naming honestly before we let the ancient sources go. The 19th century German historian Johann Gustav Droysen effectively invented the very term Hellenistic to describe the post-Alexander world this story has just walked through, and shaped, in the process, a romantic, heroic reading of Alexander as a visionary unifier of civilizations that dominated European scholarship for the following century, an interpretation carried forward well into the 20th century by the influential British historian William Woodthorpe Tarn, whose own monumental study of Alexander, published in the 1930s, presented him as an almost saintly figure genuinely committed to the brotherhood of all mankind. A reading many later historians have since concluded says at least as much about the particular hopes of Tarn's own generation, writing in the shadow of one world war and heading toward a second, as it does about the actual considerably more ruthless man this story has spent so many hours describing. More recent historians, working with a more openly critical eye and considerably less inclined to take Alexander's own carefully managed public image at face value, have pushed back hard against that romantic reading, emphasising instead the very real body count behind the cultural fusion, the political calculation behind the mercy, and the plain, unglamorous violence that built and held together an empire this large this quickly, a corrective this particular telling has tried, all night long, to hold in balance rather than swing entirely to either extreme, because the truest version of this story, as with so many others this channel has told, was probably never a single clean thing at all. One further category of evidence deserves naming on its own, because unlike every source discussed so far, it was not written by anyone with the slightest interest in telling a story about Alexander at all. Babylonian priests and scholars had, for centuries before Alexander's own birth, kept a remarkable and remarkably dry, ongoing record known today as the astronomical diaries, cuneiform tablets recording, night after night, the positions of the moon and planets alongside a running note of ordinary contemporary events, river levels, grain prices, political developments, entirely for their own administrative and astrological purposes and with no thought whatsoever of a future audience. A handful of surviving fragments from these diaries, dated to precisely the weeks of Alexander's own death, record his illness and death in Babylon in flat, unadorned, business-like language, alongside notes on the price of barley and the height of the Euphrates that same week, a document that owes nothing to Ptolemy's self-interest, nothing to Plutarch's literary tradition, and nothing to the 15 centuries of legend the Alexander romance would go on to spin, simply the plain, dated, unglamorous record of a Babylonian scribe noting that the foreign king who had ruled their city for 8 years had, in fact, died. A piece of evidence as quietly trustworthy as a coin or an inscription in so many other stories this channel has told, precisely because the person who wrote it down was not trying to convince anyone of anything at all. Archaeology has added its own quiet testimony as well, most vividly in a magnificently carved marble sarcophagus discovered in the 19th century in the royal necropolis of Sidon in modern Lebanon, a tomb that almost certainly belonged not to Alexander himself, but to a local Phoenician king who served under him, and that is covered nonetheless in vivid, exquisitely detailed relief carvings of Alexander in battle against Persian cavalry and hunting lions alongside his own companions, painted originally in colours that have long since faded, but that traces of surviving pigment still confirm, an object carved by artists who had, in all likelihood, actually seen the man they were depicting, offering modern viewers something no literary description, however detailed, can quite provide, an image made by contemporaries rather than reconstructed by writers working centuries after the fact, to the strongest. Alexander's death in Babylon left behind exactly the vacuum his own final, unresolved answer had guaranteed, and the men gathered around his deathbed, his senior generals, known to later history as the Diadochi, or successors, moved within days to try to impose some kind of workable order on a situation that had, by its very nature, no clean or obvious solution. A compromise arrangement was hastily agreed, naming Alexander's own mentally disabled half-brother Aridaeus as nominal joint king alongside the unborn child Roxana was, at that exact moment, carrying, a child who would indeed be born a son and named Alexander IV, with actual administrative power divided among the senior generals as regents and provincial governors, an arrangement that satisfied absolutely no one for very long, and that began collapsing into open warfare within a matter of months. Roxana herself, still pregnant with Alexander's unborn son at the moment of his death, wasted no time securing her own child's future against potential rivals, and the story that has come down to us, chilling in its speed, says that she lured Statera, Alexander's other wife and the daughter of Darius, along with Statera's own sister Drypetis, Hephaestion's widow, to her own quarters under false pretences within days of Alexander's death, and had them both murdered, their bodies disposed of down a well, before Perdiccas or anyone else in the new regency could even finish arguing about the terms of succession, a small, brutal, entirely predictable opening move in a game that would go on consuming nearly every remaining person with any personal claim on Alexander's own legacy within the following decade. Perdiccas, who had received Alexander's own ring in that final deathbed scene, and who therefore claimed, with some real justification, to be the dying king's intended chief regent, was murdered by his own officers within 2 years after a disastrous attempt to invade Egypt, where the general Ptolemy, moving with the same shrewd, self-interested calculation that would eventually make him the most durable of all the successors, had already secured for himself the single, richest and most defensible province of the entire former empire, going so far as to intercept the elaborate funeral cortege carrying Alexander's own embalmed body back toward Macedon, and divert it instead to Egypt, where he installed it, first at Memphis and later at Alexandria itself, in a magnificent tomb that would become one of the ancient world's great pilgrimage sites, and that has, remarkably, never been definitively located by modern archaeologists, its final resting place lost somewhere beneath the streets of the very city Alexander himself had founded. That tomb, for as long as it could still be located, went on to become one of the ancient world's most visited royal shrines, drawing, across the following 3 centuries, a long procession of famous pilgrims eager to stand before it. Julius Caesar himself is said to have visited during his own time in Egypt, and to have gazed at Alexander's preserved remains with visible and pointed admiration. The first Roman Emperor Augustus reportedly paid his own respects there as well. placing a golden crown on the sarcophagus, and, by one less flattering later account, accidentally breaking off a piece of the embalmed nose while examining it too closely, and the unstable, widely disliked Emperor Caligula is said to have taken Alexander's own breastplate from the tomb to wear himself in public, a piece of borrowed martial glory his own contemporaries found more ridiculous than impressive. The tomb's precise location was still known and still being visited as late as the early centuries after Christ, but the exact date and circumstance of its final loss to history were never recorded by anyone who thought to write it down, swallowed, sometime in the chaos of Alexandria's later Roman and early Christian centuries, by fire, by flood, by simple architectural neglect, or by some combination of all three. The wars that followed, stretching on with only brief interruptions for the better part of the next 4 decades, consumed the lives of nearly everyone with any personal claim on Alexander's own legacy. Roxana and her young son Alexander IV were murdered on the orders of the Macedonian regent Cassander around 310 before Christ, still only a child, extinguishing the last direct male line of Alexander's own immediate family. The disabled Aridaeus was murdered even earlier, in 317 before Christ, on the orders of Alexander's own formidable mother Olympias, who was herself captured and executed the following year by Cassander's own forces. And Alexander's illegitimate son by a Persian mistress, Heracles, was murdered as well, in around 309 before Christ, quietly eliminated once he had briefly served his purpose as a potential rival claimant in the hands of one faction of successors against another. By the time the dust of these wars finally settled, roughly 40 years after Alexander's own death, his single vast empire had permanently fractured into several large rival successor kingdoms, Ptolemy's own dynasty ruling Egypt from Alexandria, the Seleucid dynasty ruling the former Persian heartland from Mesopotamia to the borders of India, and the Antigonid dynasty eventually securing Macedon itself, 3 durable Hellenistic kingdoms, and several smaller ones besides, that would go on, in their own right, to shape the political and cultural map of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East for the following 2.5 centuries until Rome, in the very story this channel has already told you on another night, absorbed them one by one into its own steadily expanding orbit. It is a bitterly fitting final irony that a man who had spent 12 years cutting through every obstacle in front of him with a single decisive stroke, exactly as he had once cut through the knot at Gordium, left behind, at the one moment it mattered most, a question he never bothered to answer, and that his own empire, in the absence of any real successor, was itself cut apart piece by bloody piece by the very men who had loved him best. The wars among the successors ground on for decades beyond even these early killings, shifting alliances, forming and breaking as first one general and then another, attempted to reassemble Alexander's shattered empire under his own personal control, rather than accept the smaller, permanent division that history would eventually impose. The most serious of these attempts came from Antigonus the One-Eyed, a battle-scarred veteran of Philip's own generation, who very nearly succeeded, over the following 2 decades, in reuniting most of Alexander's Asian territories under his own rule, until a coalition of the other surviving successors finally combined against him and met his forces at the Battle of Ipsus in Asia Minor in the year 301 before Christ, a battle notable for its extensive use of war elephants, several hundred of them supplied by Seleucus, who had himself campaigned far enough east to trade for them directly, and a battle that ended with Antigonus dead on the field at over 80 years old, still fighting, and with any remaining hope of reuniting Alexander's empire under a single ruler effectively extinguished for good. Seleucus, whose own share of the wars had carried him deep into the former eastern satrapies that Alexander himself had once conquered at such enormous cost, found, when he attempted to press further east toward India, that a new power had risen in the vacuum Alexander's own withdrawal from the Hephaestus had left behind, a young Indian ruler named Chandragupta, who had built, in the years since Alexander turned back, an empire of his own stretching across most of northern India, An empire large and well organised enough that Seleucus, after a period of inconclusive fighting, chose to negotiate rather than continue the war, trading away the easternmost provinces Alexander had once claimed in exchange for a peace treaty and, in one of the more oddly specific terms of that agreement, 500 war elephants, animals Seleucus would go on to use, to considerable effect, against his fellow successors in the very wars still consuming the rest of Alexander's former empire, a quiet, almost bureaucratic postscript that closed off, permanently, any realistic prospect of Greek rule ever returning to India. Out of all this prolonged and exhausting violence, 3 durable kingdoms eventually emerged and settled into something resembling a lasting order. The Antigonid dynasty, descended from the son of the Antigonus killed at Ipsus, ruling Macedon and mainland Greece, the Seleucid dynasty, ruling the former Persian heartland from Mesopotamia, westward into Syria and Asia Minor, and the Ptolemaic dynasty, ruling Egypt from the city of Alexandria that Alexander himself had founded and that Ptolemy had made the final resting place of his own embalmed body. Of the 3, it was the Ptolemaic line that lasted longest and left, in some ways, the most vivid final imprint on the popular imagination, ruling Egypt in unbroken succession for nearly 3 centuries after Alexander's own death, right down to its very last monarch, a queen whose own dramatic final years and whose own death would eventually draw Alexander's old kingdom directly into the orbit of an entirely different rising power far to the west. A story this channel has already had occasion to tell in full on another night, and one that belongs, properly, to that telling rather than to this one, except to note here, briefly, that when Cleopatra VII finally died in the year 30 before Christ and Egypt became a Roman province, the very last surviving political fragment of Alexander's own empire, the very last throne anywhere in the world still occupied by a direct successor of one of his own generals, quietly passed out of existence, closing, after nearly 300 years, the final chapter of a story that had begun with a spear thrown into the sand of a beach at the Hellespont. What outlived him? And yet, for all the carnage of those 4 decades of succession wars, it would be a genuine mistake to conclude that Alexander's own restless, blazing life simply burned out and left nothing lasting behind it, because the world that emerged from the wreckage of his empire, the world modern historians now call the Hellenistic world, carried forward, in 100 different ways, the fusion of Greek and Eastern culture that Alexander himself had begun pursuing, however imperfectly and however violently, across the length and breadth of his own conquests. Greek became, for the first time in history, a genuinely international language of trade, administration, scholarship, and eventually of an entire new religious movement, carried by Alexander's own veterans and their descendants, into cities scattered from Egypt to the borders of India, cities that Alexander himself, or his immediate successors following the pattern he had established, had founded by the dozens, so many of them bearing his own name that a full accounting of every Alexandria across the ancient world, from Egypt to Afghanistan, still runs into the double digits even after 2,300 years of destruction, renaming and archaeological loss Alexandria Eshati, meaning the farthest, marking the very edge of his Central Asian conquests near the modern border of Tajikistan, Alexandria in Arachosia, which grew, across the centuries and through a long chain of linguistic drift, into the modern Afghan city of Kandahar, Alexandria on the Oxus, and Alexandria at Caucasum near the foothills of the Hindu Kush, each one a garrison town, a trading post, and in more than one case, a living city still standing today under a name that has simply worn smoother with age, the way a river stone loses its sharp edges without ever quite losing its shape. The Alexandria that survives most vividly in modern memory, the great city on the Egyptian coast, became, under Ptolemy's own dynasty, home to the largest library the ancient world would ever assemble, a genuine centre of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and scholarship that would go on, over the following several centuries to produce or host figures like Euclid, Eratosthenes, and Hypatia, an intellectual legacy that traces its own institutional roots directly back to the ambitions of the restless young king who had once marked out its first streets with a trail of scattered grain because he had run short of chalk. A quieter but no less durable piece of Alexander's own legacy moved through the ancient economy rather than through its libraries, because the silver coinage he minted during his campaign, stamped with the image of Heracles wearing a lion's skin on one side and a seated enthroned Zeus on the other, struck to a consistent weight standard across dozens of mints scattered from Macedon to Babylon, proved so reliable and so widely trusted that it continued circulating and continued being freshly minted by his own successors and by cities that had never seen a Macedonian soldier for more than 2 centuries after his death, becoming, in effect, the closest thing the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern world possessed to a single common international currency, accepted from Sicily to India in a way no single king's coinage had ever managed before him. Alexander's own administrative instincts, too, left a mark that outlasted the empire itself, because rather than sweeping away the Persian system of satrapies and provincial governance he had conquered, he largely kept it intact, reappointing Persian officials in a number of provinces and retaining Persian methods of taxation and record-keeping wherever they already worked efficiently, a pragmatic, unglamorous kind of governance that received far less attention from ancient biographers than any single battle, but that meant the vast machinery of Achaemenid administration, refined over 2 centuries of Persian rule, simply continued turning under new management, rather than collapsing into the kind of administrative chaos that so often follows a conquest of this speed and this scale. The example Alexander set echoed loudest, perhaps, in the ambitions of the men who came after him, and who consciously, deliberately measured themselves against his particular brand of restless glory. Pompey, the Roman general who would in time become one of the late Republic's own greatest military figures, adopted the epithet Magnus, the Great, quite deliberately in conscious imitation of Alexander's own reputation, styled his own hair in a manner ancient writers explicitly compared to Alexander's surviving portrait busts, and modelled the sweeping, rapid conquest of the eastern Mediterranean that made his own early career so celebrated directly on the pattern Alexander had set nearly 3 centuries earlier. Julius Caesar, whose own long, restless climb toward the summit of Roman power this channel has already followed in full on another night, is said by his ancient biographers to have wept upon seeing a statue of Alexander in a temple in Spain, distressed that by the same age at which the Macedonian king had already conquered most of the known world, he himself had accomplished comparatively little, a moment of naked comparative ambition that a restless mind could trace in a more or less straight line all the way to the Rubicon. And more than 2,000 years later, a young artillery officer from Corsica named Napoleon Bonaparte carried a well-worn copy of Plutarch's Lives with him on campaign, led his own army into Egypt in 1798, partly, by his own later account, in conscious homage to Alexander's own Egyptian conquest, and cultivated across his own meteoric rise from obscure provincial officer to master of most of Europe. A public mythology of destiny and singular genius that borrowed, whether Napoleon himself always recognised it or not, directly from the same well of restless, world-shrinking ambition Alexander had first drawn from on the plains outside Pella more than 2,000 years before either man was born. It is a strange and genuinely instructive pattern, the way one short, blazing life keeps reappearing, refracted and reinterpreted in the ambitions of men who never met him and who were separated from him by centuries and, in Napoleon's case, by millennia. And it says something real about the particular, dangerous magnetism of a story like this one, that so many men who came after him looked at 32 short years of life and thought, however briefly, that is what I want for myself. The language we still speak today carries Alexander's own restless legacy in ways most of us never pause to notice, because to speak of cutting the Gordian knot, In a business negotiation, or a stalled political crisis, or any other situation that seems to demand one single decisive stroke rather than a slow, patient untangling, is to reach, whether the speaker knows it or not, directly back across more than 2,300 years to a tangled wagon yoke in a Phrygian temple, and a young king who preferred force to patience. The legendary Alexander of the Alexander Romance tradition, meanwhile, travelled even further and stranger distances than the historical man himself ever managed, reappearing across the following 15 centuries as Iskandar in Persian poetry and epic, as Sikandar in the popular storytelling traditions of South Asia, and, in a detail scholars have long debated with real and appropriate caution rather than any confident final answer, as a figure some later Islamic commentators identified, though far from unanimously, with the mysterious traveller Dhul-Qarnayn, the two-horned one, mentioned briefly in the Quran, a genuinely ancient and genuinely unresolved question of religious interpretation that this channel will simply name here rather than attempt to settle, because it belongs, properly, to the scholars of that tradition rather than to a history channel telling stories at midnight. What is not in any real dispute is the sheer geographic and cultural reach of the legend itself, a young Macedonian king whose historical campaign never came remotely close to circling the globe, nonetheless becoming, within a handful of centuries of his own death, one of the most widely known and most endlessly reimagined figures in the entire literature of the medieval world, from the illuminated manuscripts of European monasteries to the poetry of Persian courts 1,000 miles from anywhere his actual army ever marched. One particular anecdote about Alexander has travelled so far from its own murky origins that it now exists almost entirely detached from the actual historical record, and it is worth naming here precisely because of how thoroughly it has outlived any of the battles this story has spent so many hours describing in careful, sourced detail. The image, familiar to countless people who could not otherwise name a single one of Alexander's actual campaigns, of the great conqueror weeping because there were no more worlds left for him to conquer. The line in that exact quotable form appears to be a much later simplification of a considerably more philosophical original anecdote, preserved in fragmentary form by ancient writers, describing a conversation in which the philosopher Anaxarchus, the very same court philosopher who had once talked Alexander into forgiving himself for the murder of Clytus, reportedly told him that current Greek natural philosophy held there to be a virtually infinite number of worlds beyond this one, at which Alexander is said to have wept, not because he had run out of things to conquer, but because he had not yet conquered even a single one of them, a considerably stranger and considerably more revealing story than the tidy, self-contained version that eventually calcified into popular usage, and one more small example of exactly how much distance can open up across 2,000 years of retelling between what a man may actually have said and what later generations found it more satisfying to believe he said. Alexander's battles, too, have gone on fighting a strange kind of afterlife of their own, studied today in military academies from West Point to Sandhurst not as museum pieces, but as living case studies in tactics that remain genuinely instructive. The oblique advance and cavalry envelopment at Gaugamela, still cited as a textbook example of how a numerically inferior force can defeat a larger one through superior manoeuvre rather than superior mass, and the night crossing and combined arms assault against Porus's own elephants at the Hydaspes, still studied as an early and remarkably sophisticated lesson in overcoming an unfamiliar enemy weapon system through careful, coordinated planning rather than simple brute force. In a considerably less rigorous register, modern psychological and business writing has occasionally borrowed his name for a loosely defined condition, sometimes called the Alexander complex, describing a restless, driven personality, often a highly successful one, that experiences ordinary contentment as something close to a personal failure, always needing a next mountain, a next market, a next campaign to conquer, a diagnosis no ancient physician would ever have thought to make, but one that a great many modern readers, looking back across the sheer restless velocity of Alexander's own short life, have found difficult entirely to dismiss. Let us walk back now, through the whole long shape of this story, gathering up everything it actually leaves behind, because a life this consequential deserves, before we let it go for the night, one final honest accounting of everything it touched. A boy born into a rough frontier kingdom that the southern Greek world barely counted as civilized inherited, from a father whose own considerable achievements have been almost entirely swallowed by his son's far larger shadow, an army trained and equipped more effectively than any force the Greek-speaking world had yet produced, and used it, in the space of 12 relentless years, to destroy the largest empire on earth, to found cities that would outlive every one of the kingdoms that eventually fought over his own corpse, and to push the boundaries of the known world further east than any Greek or Macedonian had ever imagined marching. He showed a genuine capacity for mercy and cultural respect toward defeated royalty, even as he ordered the wholesale destruction of entire cities and the enslavement of tens of thousands of ordinary people who had never wronged him personally. He mourned a fallen enemy with what appears to have been real feeling, and he murdered a man who had once saved his own life in a fit of drunken rage he then sought philosophical permission to forgive himself for. He pursued, with genuine and far-sighted ambition, a vision of a single blended empire uniting Macedonian and Persian, Greek and Asian into one shared ruling class, and he died, at not yet 33 years old, without ever once sitting down to answer the single most important question any king who has built something this vast and this fragile is ever obligated to answer: who comes next? And because he never answered it, the empire he had built with such staggering, unrepeatable speed came apart within a single generation, in the hands of the very men who had marched beside him from one end of the known world to the other, cut apart in the end, exactly as he himself had once cut apart the knot at Gordium by force, because no one left behind knew how to untie it any other way. That brings us to the end of our long story tonight, and as always, it leaves behind more questions than it answers, which is, perhaps, exactly as it should be, because the truest stories from this deep in the past almost always do. We will never know with any real certainty what Alexander actually heard or believed he heard in that remote desert oracle at Siwa, whether the young king who never bothered to correct the whispers of divine parentage secretly believed them himself in some genuine and unsettling way, or whether he understood, with the same cold political clarity he applied to nearly everything else, that a conquered world simply governs more easily for a man its people have already half convinced themselves is more than merely mortal. We will never know exactly what illness closed over him in that room in Babylon, or whether, in the strange and unsettling possibility some modern doctors have raised, some faint thread of awareness lingered in his own paralysed body for hours or even days after the men around him had already begun to grieve him as gone. What we do know is that a knot was cut instead of untied on a cold morning in a Phrygian temple, and a spear was thrown into the sand of a beach he had never before set foot on, and a ring was pressed into a dying man's outstretched hand without a single word of explanation to go with it, and an empire built entirely around the irreplaceable person of one restless, brilliant, deeply flawed young man came apart within a matter of months, precisely because he had never once, across 12 years of conquering nearly everything else in front of him, found the time, or perhaps simply the willingness, to conquer the one problem that could not be solved with an army. What happens to everything you have built the moment you yourself are no longer there to hold it together? There is something in this story too that reaches past the battles and the borders and settles somewhere closer to home, because Alexander's whole life amounts to about as complete and as dramatic an answer as history has ever produced to a very old, very human question. What would you actually do if nothing and no one could stop you? Most of us never have to find out. Alexander did from the age of 20, and the answer his own life gives back to us is neither simple reassurance nor simple warning, because a man with no meaningful limits built cities that still stand, spread language and learning across 3 continents, and treated a defeated enemy's family with genuine lasting kindness. And that same man with no meaningful limits burned a living city over an old grudge that was not even his own, murdered a friend over a dinner table insult, and drove thousands of ordinary people to their deaths in a desert crossing undertaken chiefly to prove a point to a long-dead legendary queen. Perhaps the most honest thing this particular life has to offer anyone lying awake tonight, then, is not a lesson about ambition at all, but a quieter, stranger comfort that even a man who conquered nearly everything in front of him for 12 consecutive years still could not conquer the one thing every single one of us eventually has to face lying still in a darkened room, and that the empire he built, for all its staggering size, turned out to be exactly as fragile in the end as any other thing built entirely around one irreplaceable person, which is to say, considerably more fragile than it ever looked from the outside while he was still alive to hold it together. Perhaps the truest thing left to say about Alexander, sitting here with the whole long shape of his short life laid out before us in the dark, is that he was never, at any single point across this entire story, only one thing at a time. He was the 18-year-old prince who broke the unbroken sacred band at Chæronea, and the grieving old man's memory of a spear thrown at a banquet table that could never be unthrown. He was the conqueror who laid his own cloak over a defeated rival's murdered body, and the same man who crucified 2,000 captives along a stretch of Phoenician coastline as a calculated lesson to the next city that might dare to resist him. He was the visionary who married his own officers to Persian noblewomen in the hope of building one people out of 2, and the increasingly isolated, increasingly paranoid king whose own oldest friends had learned, by the very end, to measure every word they spoke to him against the risk of a spear thrown in anger. History rarely offers a figure this young, and this fast, and this total in his achievements, who resolves this cleanly into hero or villain. And Alexander, perhaps more than almost anyone else this channel has told you about, across all its long nights together, refuses that resolution entirely, remaining to the very end exactly what he was on that final fevered couch in Babylon, a man of almost limitless ambition and almost limitless gifts, spent in nearly equal measure on building and on breaking, whose story asks us even now, more than 2,000 years later, to hold both hands open at once and not to look away from either one. Thank you, as always, for spending this quiet stretch of the night here with me, in this small corner of the internet, listening to a story that is, in the end, more than 2,000 years old and yet still, somehow, entirely about us, about ambition and the people it leaves behind, about the difference between the empire a man conquers and the empire he actually manages to hold together, and about how easily even the most extraordinary life can end, in the end, with the single, most important question of all left quietly, permanently unanswered. If this is the kind of story that helps you drift off at night, please do consider subscribing, and if you are able, help this small channel on its own slow way toward 10,000 subscribers. And remember, if you're watching this on YouTube, that these episodes now go up early over on Spotify for creators, with the link waiting for you down in the description. And if you're already listening on Spotify, simply search for Historian at Midnight on YouTube to find everything else this channel has told. And whatever knot you happen to be sitting with tonight, whatever tangled, difficult thing in your own life is refusing to come loose no matter how patiently you have tried to work it free, it is, in the end, almost certainly smaller than an empire, and it will very likely still be there in the morning, waiting for you to look at it again with clearer eyes than any of us ever have in the middle of the night. Close your eyes now. Let the rest of this old story settle over you like a blanket, and let it carry you, gently, all the way down into sleep. Good night, and sweet dreams.